And good yesterday.
And good yesterday to those just joining. And welcome to Medieval Storytime with the Creative Contessa. I am the Contessa, and we will start, of course, with the traditional getting dressed. Today I will be dressing in 15th century English attire for casual at-home wear, which looks shockingly like 15th century Flemish attire and shockingly also like 15th century French attire, because today we're going to be exploring some records and tales of crime from the dynasty of the Plantagenets, which, of course, for those who don't know, that's basically Henry II to Richard III. So if you have any questions as we're going along in the process, then please do feel free to pop them in the live chat. Twitchy, your good early morning to you, my dear.
Twitchy and Haas are both
Yeah,
on
Twitchy
already.
and Haas are both on. Haas, it's also early in the morning, not quite as early as it is in the United Kingdom, but so yeah, I have been once more trawling through a variety of records and chronicles and finding some really illuminating documents that cast a light on the past. And so today's story time will be a non-fictional story time, but one that may actually put you in mind of fiction, because as I've often said, fact is stranger than fiction. And in the case of history, this is nearly always the case. So we have today some readings about grain sellers, unscrupulous grain sellers in London, actually, and the sorts of strictures that were taken against them to protect the poor, in fact, from being taken advantage of. Because one of those horrible misconceptions of the medieval world is that the poor were just ruthlessly exploited and abused, and no one stood up for their rights, and they were at the mercy of the king, who was, of course, always a tyrant. And that is just not true. A weird white spot on my finger, and I'm trying to figure out what that. Oh, I had a band-aid on it, whatever. And that is, of course, not always true. And in fact, many of the injustices, much of more the poverty, most of the crimes against humanity that people misattribute to the Middle Ages are in fact an artifact, because people made them, of the modern era. And I think that really throws people for quite a loop. Good morning, Red. Nice to see you. Thank you for joining us again. Susan, lovely to see you as well. So we will, of course, also be discussing these texts once I read them, and I'll be providing you with extra information, extra context, so that you can better understand them. Because, of course, it is, under reading these sorts of documents, just reading them straight, you don't necessarily understand what's actually happening. So I will be providing the context that will hopefully enable you to better comprehend the situation of the era in question. And I hope that today you walk away with a better, richer, fuller understanding of the medieval world. So for those just joining, welcome to my medieval story time. I am commencing with our traditional getting dressed. I am just in the process of lacing up my kirtel, as it would have been called in 15th century English. This is basically the base layer for pretty much everyone in Europe. The shape of the kirtel differed from region to region, the neckline, the specific cut, but the basic idea that you have an intermediary layer that goes over top of your undershirt and under the overgown, that's pretty ubiquitous through all of Europe in the 15th century. Oh, bugger. I completely missed the bottom hole. Well, have to start again. So if you have any questions about daily life in the Middle Ages, about what people ate, what they drank, how they lived their lives, what dances were like, what medieval fashion, feel free to pop those in the live stream and I will be happy to answer them. And if you are, if in particular you have any questions about myths that you've heard, myths, rumors about the Middle Ages, about medieval life, then absolutely do ask those, because myth busting is one of the favorite things we do on this channel. And if you're just joining my community, if you've just stumbled across me late at night or early in the morning, depending on your time, then consider liking and subscribing. And welcome. This thing just does not want to seat today, and I don't know why. Okay, there we go. So I'm lacing this gown up, and this is a kind of lacing called spiral lacing. Zippers did not exist in the Middle Ages. They were invented in the 19th century. Snaps did not exist in the Middle Ages. They were invented either at the end of the 19th century or the early 20th century. So this was the main way to lace up clothing for men, or to close clothing for men and women when the clothing was fitted. And yes, we do know that even women on the lower echelons of society dressed this way also, that they also had garments that closed by lacing, because they also wanted fitted garments under their voluminous garments to provide support, bust support in the case of women, and to also help keep them warm, right? It was part of the insulating layerage that was a key component of comfort in the Middle Ages. Cut the grass today. This is a bedtime story. Yeah, medieval grass cutting, by the way, was done by sheep. It is the best way to have a nice lawn, is to get a happy herd of sheep and just let them do their thing. And you will have the lushest, nicest grass you can ever imagine, as long as those sheep have enough room to keep going. Best way to have a good, nice lawn. Forget the machine. And bushwhacking, best done by goats. And in fact, I believe I know for a fact that there are goat rental services in various places, at least in the United States. I can't speak for anywhere in the EU, but there are goat rental services, or in the UK, since it's no longer part of the EU. Anyway, there are goat rental services where you can rent a certain number of goats of your choosing, and they will bushwhack for you. They will eat the weeds. They will eat gosh, what are those things called? The thorn bushes. They will eat all the thorn bushes, right? All of those plants that just take over your yard. Goats will eat them. And then they will poop out the consumed good as fertilizer. So you'll actually have a much happier yard. So if you have a yard that has become overgrown, or you have problematic plants such as kudzu and blackberries, that's what I was looking for, blackberry bushes, which do take over, then consider renting your own personal herd of goats or batch of goats, a group of goats, and they will take care of it for you. I did use a small sickle to cut some grass today. I just bought it. That's intense. Yeah, so yesterday we had our medieval cooking party, and actually I had a revelation. Damn it, I missed a lace somewhere. That's where I missed the lace. How in God's name did that happen? Yep, okay, well, I'm going to leave it. I don't feel like relacing this. That's just going to have to do. It'll be a conversation piece for anyone who wonders why my lacing is all wonky. It's because I missed a lace hole at the bottom, and now it's not lining up, but I want to get to our story time before everyone falls asleep. So we will press onward. I have a braid that came undone from my workout this morning. I have to redo that a little bit. So Brandon, welcome. Thank you for joining us. So the medieval cooking party yesterday, I had a revelation in the night. We actually ate the failed, quote unquote, failed fritter, and also fritter should be in quotes, and it was delicious. And then I went and I looked back at the original Italian recipe, and I shouldn't have let myself get bound up in the translation. I know better as a professional translator. I should really just work straight from the Italian translation, but because not many other people speak Italian in my community or in the world, relatively speaking, I got stuck in using the English translation, and that's where it all went wrong. If I had focused much more together with you on the Italian, I would have come to a completely different conclusion from the very outset of the process. And so we would have had a very different set of outcomes. Why, you ask? Well, I went and looked at the original Italian, and it doesn't say fritter. It's a terrible translation. Scully, if you're out there, fritter is a bad translation of the word frittata. Frittata is not a fritter. It's not. A fritter is a very specific kind of thing. A frittata is actually basically a big omelet. It's a kind of omelet, honestly. And if I'd really paid attention to that particular interpretation better, I would have taken a different approach. So after this live stream, I'm going to take the rest of the bean mash that we made yesterday, and I'm going to treat it like a frittata. And I think that the outcome is going to be much more desirable and much more akin to probably what the original recipe actually intended. So yeah, there's that. Emma Thompson. Definitely not Emma Thompson. I don't think Emma Thompson. I guess maybe Emma Thompson in Henry V. Italian just reads differently than English, doesn't it? It's so, Jim. So here's the thing about, for those who don't know, I'm actually a professional translator. That was my first career, which has now been destroyed by artificial intelligence, generative AI. Did away with it completely. It's done. There is anyone who's still holding on to a career in translation is doing so in obstinate defiance of the realities of the field, right? So, but I therefore actually understand how translation works. And translation is not a game of cognates. It's not a game of take a word from Italian, find a similar sounding word in English and plug and play. Translation is a game of meaning, of semantics. You have to understand the meaning. And to understand the meaning of the original language, the source language, you actually really have to have a deep understanding of the subject matter, in this case, culinary arts. Now, Terence Scully absolutely has a very profound understanding of cuisine, which is why the translation baffles me a little bit. So if I had actually looked at the original Italian, I would have gotten the meaning from the Italian rather than the translation. So it's not a question that English and Italian read differently. I mean, they're completely different languages. It's a question of the meaning, the correct implications were not communicated in the translation. And cognates, a cognate is a word that sounds similar from one language to another. There's a concept in foreign language learning called false friends. And cognates can be false friends, meaning that they sound like they're similar. They sound like they're the same word because they sound similar. But in fact, the meanings are actually drastically different. There's a lot of false friends between languages. And frittata is absolutely a false friend with the word fritter, because the word fritter has very specific connotations of a deep fried, sort of single serving sized item that is that then is a cohesive mass that just takes its own shape. And a frittata is not that. That is not a frittata. Anyway, yeah, there we go. Takeda, thank you for joining us. Yeah, Tomikor says, my ex-wife is an English Cantonese translator. Yep. Well, her Cantonese and Mandarin are still, the translation machines are still maybe a little raw on those, although not really. I will tell you that there are English Korean translation apps now that produce absolutely idiomatic sounding English. I mean, and accurate. So we live in the worst time. Anyway, good morning from India. Vuhams, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Why Won't This Not Sit Evenly? God's blood, as they would say in the language of the era. It's just the smock is not behaving itself. I'm gonna put a pin and make it stay where I want it to. Yeah. God's blood, as they would have said in 15th century English. Okay, good morning. Well, inteligencia, gracias. Thank you very much. Lovely of you to say so. So everyone, welcome to Medieval Storytime. I am now basically dressed. Oh, Susan said bling. Let me see what bling I'm going to do this morning. I think I will do little bling. We'll do petite bling. This lovely necklace is by Armor and Castings, and it is a replica of a jewel owned and worn by Beatrice d'Este, of very famous 15th century fame, one of the great princesses of Italy who was a Renaissance woman and very powerful and influential in her own right. Okay, so let's get down to the business of story time. First, let me start off with a little bit of tea to wet my palate. Where is everyone watching this morning? I think we have quite a diverse viewership, which I really appreciate. So I was talking to a friend this morning, medieval story time, this is very relevant, about the Arthurian legends. Have any of you read any of the Arthurian romances, the medieval ones, not modern retellings? The original medieval ones written by robber barons like Thomas Malory, or one of the greatest French poets ever, Chrétien de Troyes, these sorts of original authors, right? If you really start reading those closely, you don't have to read them that closely, honestly, you're going to realize that the damsel in the tower, the damsel in distress, is actually not a medieval trope. Not really. And it's definitely not a trope that originates in the Arthurian romances, because women in Arthurian romances are powerful and scary very often. They're and sometimes predatory, which I guess is actually reflects more about male psychology in the Middle Ages than it does about actual medieval women. But my point is that they are not helpless bystanders. Very often they are agents. They are powerful agents, and they're dangerous agents. And I don't know how often these legends start off with, it was Christmas or Pentecost at King Arthur's court, and a strange woman wanders in bearing a sword or a cloak or some other item and issues a challenge, and one of the knights of his court stupidly accept the challenge and invariably nearly always die. But they never learn. It's like there is no object permanence in the Arthurian court when it comes to dangerous women. They're just, ooh, she's really pretty. Ooh, she's got a pretty shiny thing. Let's go. Yeah. Sean Arnold, watching from Canada. Thank you for joining us. Ooh, autumn, a beautiful autumn day in Sydney. That sounds gorgeous. And actually, Red, it sounds like we're basically experiencing the exact same weather at opposite ends of the planet, more or less, or the equivalent parallels north and south of the equator. So that's really fun. I want to read Eagle Boy, an Irish Arthurian tale by Brian O'Cochrane. Tommy Core, when was Brian O'Cochrane writing? I'm out of curiosity. Oh, by the way, Tommy Core, I've got some really bad news for you. That song that you wanted Ryan to learn on the lute, it is not even the tiniest bit medieval. The songwriter, the man who composed it, was born in 1670, and it was set not to Irish music. The poem he wrote, the song he wrote, was set to a popular English tune from the 17th century, which is what most traditional Irish music, where the modern traditional Irish music has its origins, is actually, I hate to tell you this, 17th and 18th century English music. Yeah, sorry, not medieval at all. Like I said, I cannot find any documentably medieval Irish music, sadly. Yep. Nope, not early 1600s. 1670 is when he was born. Not early. Okay, so. Sorry, different person. Sorry, I understood. Brian O'Cochrane was born in the early 1600s. Interesting. I've never even heard of that, Eagle Boy. That's an interesting title. I feel like that's a bad translation. Eagle Boy. I mean, bad translation. I mean, it's an unnuanced translation, right? It just doesn't convey probably the really more profound mystical meanings that tend to be tied with a lot of the Arthurian legends. A lot of people fail to view medieval romances and stories in their proper allegorical and or mystical sense. For example, one of my favorite Arthurian romances in quotes, by the way. Remember, guys, romance doesn't mean something that's romantic as in love. Romance was actually the original word from a novel. Like, that is the original novel. And so romances don't necessarily have any kind of romantic love whatsoever in them. And so one of my favorite ones absolutely does not have any, and that is the Conte du Graal by Chrétien de Troyes. right? The story of the Grail. And it's the one of the most mystical compositions that's still somewhat comprehensible and interesting to read anyway, in terms of actually having an adventure story behind it of the Middle Ages, because it presents Perceval as this green inexperienced young man going on this adventure of into adulthood basically, and he actually encounters the le roi pêcheur, the fisher king, which is actually le roi pêcheur. It's a play on words because pêcheur could be fisherman, but it could also be sinner. And so it turns out that this king has committed some kind of sin and he is suffering somewhat eternally for it. And Perceval attends this, goes and pays court to le roi pêcheur, who is, somehow tied, related to Arthur and his lineage. And he experiences all these very mystical scenes where there's the lance of Longinus and the Grail, and he doesn't seem to understand that he's actually currently part of something much bigger than himself. But the language is so beautiful, and it's just you can feel the veil of mysticism surrounding the entire thing from the way that Chrétien writes it. It's really beautiful. I've read it in the French. I would assume probably in the English. An English translation might not succeed in having the same degree of, what's the word I'm looking for? It might not have the same degree of impact as the original French does. But that's one of the benefits of being a linguist in European languages, is that I can read these things in the original language. Okay, just check the microphone. Is it actually on? It is. Okay, everyone. Well, let us get started. So this is a book that is actually very inexpensively available. Everyone a Witness. And I know it's not mirrored, and I don't know if I don't think this has a mirror option. It does not, sadly. Okay, I can't mirror it here. But Everyone a Witness, The Plantagenet Age. This is a source book, and source books are not new, but I guess they're actually not new, but they're becoming more popular and they're becoming more common. So a source book for any period of history is a compilation that pulls together primary source excerpts from a variety of original primary sources that help paint an accurate picture of the era through the eyes of those who were present at the time. So rather than a standard history book, which is second or third-hand interpretation of primary sources, this is just the primary sources with no interpretation, so that you can develop your own idea about the period in question. So if you're looking for more books like this, the key search term is source book. Medieval source book, Renaissance source book, medieval French source book, Norse era, Viking source book, whatever. That's what you want. So this is a source book in essence. And I have several different source books, and they're all fantastic because they all have pulled together different kinds of texts to create this beautiful, beautiful tapestry about the medieval world. Yes, that's a real tapestry. This is not an AI background, in case anyone is wondering. Yeah, so Everyone a Witness. Yep. Okay, so where are we going to start today? Let me see where I started making my marks. Oh, right. So I thought it might be interesting to hear, actually, so we've transitioned. I know we promised Crime and Punishment, and we will get to Crime and Punishment, I promise. But we also started this live stream off by talking about medieval cookery. And so I thought it might be a good thing for us to actually discuss the goods that were available in a medieval kitchen. Specifically, this one is 1430 England, as it would have been pronounced in the 15th century. Some snobby Brit objected to that pronunciation in one of my videos, not understanding that I was pronouncing the word England in the 15th century English way as part of the 15th century English video on English history. And they thought it was a real gotcha moment. And like, oh, fail on your part, because that is how it was pronounced in the 15th century. But thank you for being a pedantic snob and allowing me to point out to everyone that you don't know the history of your own language, whatever. Anyway, so this is an inventory of the kitchen goods of Sir John Fastolf, not Falstaff, Fastolf. And this is actually from one of the Paston letters, letter 336. If you are not familiar with the Pastons, you must come to know them. They are such an emblematic family of 15th century England because they are the up and coming middling sort. They start out as artisans, basically, who become aldermen in their local town, and then they climb the socio-political ladder, eventually becoming minor gentry after just 2 generations. And they're very wealthy business people. And what's remarkable about the Pastons is that hundreds upon hundreds of their letters and personal papers and their business papers have survived in a massive collection to the modern era. And they correspond about every kind of thing you can imagine. And the beautiful thing about private correspondence is that it's almost, in my opinion, the most objective source of information you can have, because they're writing for when they're writing to each other, members of the family, right? This is not something that's supposed to ever be read by anyone. So they're under no obligation to sugarcoat anything. They don't have to please a patron in their words or their documenting of history. So when they write about things like engagements during the 30 or the 100 Years' War or engagements during the Wars of the Roses, they can do so as objectively as their, personal human bias may allow, versus the chronicles of this era, which are always written to please a king or a queen or a princess or a prince or a specific target audience. And so, you have to take their recordings with a grain of salt. Correspondence, in my opinion, is one of those forms of literature that you can actually often take at face value, right? Much more at face value than chronicles, at any rate. So this is letter number 336, and an excerpt from it, not the whole letter. The interesting thing, like I said, they talk about the most mundane details, the most prosaic details of daily life in these letters, including things like, please send me another doublet. It's getting cold, and the doublet that I'm wearing, that I have currently on this campaign, is wearing out. Please send bread. We have no more from, the Duke is no longer providing bread for his soldiers, that kind of thing. So this is, curiously, an inventory of the goods, the kitchen goods of Sir John Fastolf, who is connected to the Pastons. So these are the items, all of the items that were found in his kitchen, basically when he died. So this is a death inventory. So, and why would that be in part of their papers? Because when someone died in England and in many places in Europe, they would conduct what was called a probate inventory or a death inventory to document all the belongings in the house that belonged to this individual for the purposes of tax assessment and also for the purposes of estate assessment. So that if there was any kind of division of goods amongst the testees in the will, that it would be properly distributed. So you had to figure out what was actually in the house in order to understand how to distribute everything. So probate wills are another super objective view into daily life in the Middle Ages, because you will literally get to peek through every cupboard in every room in a person's residence, from poor dairymaids, relatively poor dairymaids, all the way up to kings had these wills done. I'm not exaggerating. It's one of those stages of life that seem to have, death really did bond everyone. It really was the ultimate equalizer, because in death, everyone underwent more or less the same treatment, maybe with different levels of pomp and circumstance, but nevertheless. Yeah, it is amazing that they survived so well. It really, Takeda, it's super amazing considering all of the wars that have since happened in England, as it was once pronounced, right? You have the rest of the Wars of the Roses. You've got the Reformation, which is super duper destructive. You've got the English Civil War. And then, of course, the Blitz during World War II was pretty destructive as well. So it is, and fires, just fires, random fires that happen on a regular basis, like the Great Fire of London, right? Buildings caught on fire all the time in the pre-modern era, much more often than they do now, and they didn't have the organized fire departments that we now have. So it is amazing that they've survived. It really is. Okay, the kitchen goods of Sir John Falstaff. So I'd like you all, you can watch me if you want, but also maybe just close your eyes and try to imagine these items. Okay, so these seem to be arrayed, as far as I can tell, maybe in order of value. Okay, he had one great brass pot, 6 coarsely made brass pots. There were 3 cupboards in his kitchen. Those are furniture, by the way. This would be movable, so these aren't nailed to the wall. This is an actual proper piece of furniture, right? 1 frying pan, 4 little brass pots, 4 great brass pots, 3 brass pike pans, 2 ladles and 2 skimmers of brass, 1 cauldron, 1 ditten pan, ditten is in quotes, of brass, 1 dropping pan. I'd call it a drippings pan, actually, but that's my translation. 1 gridiron, and I'm pronouncing that word intentionally that way because it's going to trigger some people. Talk about that in a minute. 4 rakes, 3 trivets, 1 dressing knife, 1 fire shovel, 2 trays, 2 great square spits, 2 square spits, 1 brass sieve, 1 brass mortar and 1 pestle, 1 grate, 1 wooden sieve or colander, spelt colander in the 15th century English, 1 flesh hook, 2 pot hooks, 1 pair of tongs, 1 strainer, 1 vinegar bottle. Okay, yes. So yeah, so we will go back through and talk about each of these items, I promise, because I want to provide you with the context. And the Ditton is a question, a very good question. Okay. So, first off, the very good question is, was Sir John Falstaff wealthy? He was considered gentry. And with all of these goods in his kitchen, he was at least upper middling sort in terms of earnings. I haven't looked at his actual income, but he was certainly relatively comfortable. And he would have been in this era in 1430, he would have been the better of the Pastons, shall we say. They were not yet gentry at this point. They were still just the middling sort. He was gentry, hence Sir John Falstaff. So yes, he was a man of means. Was he a peer? No. Was he equivalent to the Duke of Bedford in terms of wealth? Absolutely not. But even just reading through all of these items, he was relatively wealthy because there's a lot of metal items in here. In the 15th century, they had usually at least 3 different grades of material out of which to make any given kitchen implement. And wood, ceramic, and some metal, some kind of metal. More of metal alloys of more or less expense and value. Right? And you'll notice that most of the kitchen items are made of metal. So let's go back through this. So he has a whole bunch of brass pots, right? And brass is a relatively expensive alloy in this era. And smiths, everyone talks about blacksmiths now, and most people don't realize that historically there were more colors of smiths. And I don't mean that, God, I definitely don't mean that in terms of skin color, ethnicity, or race. No. I mean in the materials that they worked in. A blacksmith historically is a smith that works with iron, right? And I'm going to say it in a way it's going to trigger some people. Iron. And iron, by the way, is how they pronounce iron or iron in the British pronunciation in various places in the English-speaking world. It is not a mispronunciation. It's a pronunciation specific to certain regions. And in my part of the world, lower, slower Delaware, there are actually certain pronunciations that have survived from 17th century English, believe it or not. Iron is actually how the word was pronounced in Middle English. It was completely phonetic. Over time, the syllables kind of got swallowed, and then you get iron. But that's not how it used to be pronounced. And that triggered some people in a recent video, so I thought I'd just triply trigger them if possible. I'm calling them out on being pronunciation snobs when they don't understand the variety of pronunciation that is English, actually, by native speakers. Anyway, back to the topic here. So brass pots. He has brass pike pans. Pike was a very popular fish amongst the amongst the more well-heeled in medieval society. There are lots of recipes that have survived for pike. And it's very interesting that we have here an indication that there was a special pan for it. I haven't been able to find a depiction, 15th century depiction of a pike pan. So I don't know how it would have differed. And frankly, fish is not my forte in the cooking world because I generally don't like most fish. I like them as fish. They're fine in the water. I just don't like to eat many of them. Most of them are not to my taste. I didn't grow up eating fish because my father doesn't like fish. So fish, I'm a relative latecomer to the world of fish, which logically means I generally don't like fishy fish. Pike, I'm not very fond of. So I don't actually know how to cook pike, and I don't know what a pike pan might have looked like. I haven't found a visual representation of one as far as I know. So if you have a 15th century visual representation of a pike pan, if you know of one, let me know because I'd be interested to see what this pike pan might look like. But we know that there was such a thing and that it was clearly very distinguishable from other kinds of pans. Fish are friends, not food. I still catch and eat wild pike. That's super cool. Super cool, Jim. Love it. Love it. But I just, there's not many fish that I've eaten that I actually like. Yeah, I don't like bony fish. I definitely don't like bony fish. It's too much work. It's just too much work. I don't want my food to be more work than just cooking it. Okay, so we have that Ditton pan of brass, and I will be honest, Ditton is D-Y-T-Y-N. I haven't been able to actually locate what a Ditton pan might have been. So if you have an idea of what a Ditton pan, D-Y-T-Y-N, might have been, do let me know in the comments. I have not been able to locate it yet, but it was made of brass, so it was expensive. And he had a dripping pan. So a dripping pan is a very specific, and let me continue the sentence. It's a very specific pan. It's oblong, and you see these in 15th century, I think I've seen one in the 14th century too, depictions of people spit roasting meat. Because a dripping pan would be the pan that you would put under the meat on the spit so that the drippings would go into the pan, and then you would save the drippings and use them to make gravy. Even in the Middle Ages, we know they did this. This also kept the drippings from just splattering everywhere and burning and creating all kinds of mess. From those of you who may have roasted things on meat on high temperature in your oven and had it splatter everywhere in the oven and cause smoke, the same thing will happen if you're cooking on a spit over the fire. So the idea is to try to catch the drippings in a pan that collects them all, and then you can reuse them. And so he had a dripping pan. The interesting thing here is they don't specify whether it was ceramic or not. And so it may well have been ceramic, because everything else, when it's metal, it seems that they indicate that it is such. So the implication might be that the dripping pan was ceramic instead, because I have seen extant ceramic dripping pans actually that have survived, or pans they think might have been dripping pans because they look like the ones in the depiction that were made of ceramic. So maybe it wasn't a metal dripping pan because it isn't specified as being brass or some other metal. It might have been a ceramic one. Right. Okay, one gridiron. So a gridiron is basically a grill. It's like what we would look at as a grill. It's a square or a rectangle with iron hammered into a grid, basically. And this was what they used to grill things. So they did actually grill meat and fish on this gridiron. And you might see the most common representation of a gridiron might be with St. Lawrence, right? Saint Lawrence, San Lorenzo, right? San Laurence, because his martyrdom allegedly was to be grilled to death on a gridiron. So he's often depicted with that at his side in more or less size, greater or smaller size. So if you want to see what a 15th century gridiron might have looked like, look up a 15th century depiction of St. Lawrence. And that's probably the best, most detailed depiction you're going to get of it. But they were very common. It was there's lots of recipes that have survived that indicate that meats or fish should have been grilled over the fire. And there are some depictions of 15th century cookery in kitchens where you can actually see the gridiron depicted. So it's here. Our Sir John Fastolf indeed owned a gridiron. Then they talk about rakes. 4 rakes. Now, these are not for These are not for raking leaves in your yard. They, as far as I know, they didn't really do that very much in the Middle Ages. I haven't seen evidence of it anyway. But this is for the fire, right? So fire management was a massive part of cooking in the medieval kitchen, so much so that a good cook should have a very good understanding of how to manage the fire. And, raking the coals, raking the embers, raking together coals, raking them apart is a big part in either dispersing the heat from the fire or from the heat of your hearth, or collecting it and being able to raise or lower the temperature of your cooking area, right? That's how there was no knob. You didn't turn on your electrical field and then the glass gets hot, or turn on the gas and ignite it and add more or less gas to make your stove hotter or colder. No, no, no. You either built up the fire or you dispersed it, or either you could lower your pot towards the flames or towards the coals, or raise it up, or scoot it towards the flames or towards the coal, or scoot it away, right? But part of that management process would have been a rake. And he had 4 of them, which might indicate that his kitchen had a big hearth. If you need 4 rakes, maybe it's because you have a bigger hearth. Otherwise, it seems kind of excessive to have 4 rakes, honestly. Catherine, thank you for joining us today. Welcome. Welcome. Yeah. Right. Okay, so 3 trivets. A trivet is not, in this case, for putting hot pots on and letting them cool. A trivet, in this case, is a way to put legless pots over coals or over a fire and allow it to cook. Trivets it was basically a metal triangle, and it had 1 leg on each point of the triangle of varying heights. And I've seen extant trivets that have relatively short legs, and I've seen extant trivets with relatively long legs. So it could be that each of these trivets maybe had legs of different length to specifically account for needing different distances from the coal or the flames. And that's another way in which a medieval cook would raise or lower the heat to their pots, was to put it on a trivet of varying heights. And a trivet is a way to not need to worry about suspending a pot, right? Because you can suspend a pot over coals or over flames, but that requires a whole separate system. And that's also a lot fussier to raise and lower when you already have a hot hearth than to just deal with a trivet and use trivets of different heights. I've done this, I've tried all this, and I can tell you I'd rather work with trivets than with one of those adjustable levers that raises or lowers pots from the 15th century. How did rake become a mean name instead of a classy thing if rakes equals more ovens equals more money? So that's a great question, etymologically speaking. I haven't looked into the etymology of rake. But so rake also, and it would have been pronounced raka in 15th century English, to be clear. And rak or raka is also a gate in the 15th century, meaning like horses rake, like the horses that rake, that gate, that 5-step gate, that is a gate that existed in the 15th century. And so that word already had that meaning in the 15th century. And it's also a 15th century dance term for a step. So, and we don't know actually what it was exactly. There's some theories. Maybe it was drawing backwards diagonally or sideways or just straight backwards, because of where it appears in 15th century English dances seems to line up where the word reprise or ripresa appears in their Italian and French cousins, but we really don't know. So the word raka in 15th century English has a lot of different meanings. So yeah, how it came in very modern English to mean a cad, a bad version of Casanova, I actually don't know. But sometimes, very often, you can actually have 2 words, homophones, words that sound exactly the same and might even be spelt the same eventually, but that have completely different meanings and completely different origins. An example I'll give you is the word curry. Okay, so in modern English, curry, curry, means a dish originally from the Indian subcontinent that is very saucy, right? And actually the word curry, that version of the word curry comes from a Tamil origin of a word that means sauce, right? But the word curry in 15th century English existed and doesn't mean at all that. Curry in 15th century English just means cookery. and it's spelt the same, but it comes from the French word cuire, to cook. It's a corruption of the French word cuirer or cuire. So either cookery, the middle French word for cooking, cookery, or the medieval French word for to cook. And yet we have these two words that have the same spelling and completely different meanings. So it could be a question of it has also a different etymological origin. It's a good question. I'll have to check that out later on. Reptiles, welcome back. Thank you for joining us. Did the Met Gala exist back then? No. The Met Gala did not, but the equivalent of the Met Gala did. I mean, to be frank, people dressing up in their finest, fanciest attire and going on parade in front of the folk, the common folk, that's an entry ceremony, basically. So that existed for certain. But something exactly like the Met Gala, no. That's more of a 17th century thing, honestly. Exactly like the way the Met Gala does it. More 17th century. Okay, so let me just see if I missed any comments. Okay, great question. So back to our list of kitchen goods. So everyone, if you're just joining, welcome to Medieval Storytime. I am the Contessa of the Creative Contessa, and we are actually just going through an inventory of kitchen items that belong to Sir John Fastolf, who died in roughly 1430. This is what was in his kitchen when he passed away. And we're just talking, therefore, about medieval kitchen items. And I'm trying to paint for you what a medieval kitchen would have actually looked like in 15th century England. Right. So we have one dressing knife, that's a carving knife. So medieval cutlery was very sophisticated and very specific. So there were special knives and special knife sets that were just for carving and serving at table. And some of these have actually survived, especially from the Duchy of Burgundy, the ones that belong to Charles the Bold, who died in 1477 when his campaign camp was overrun by Swiss mercenaries, and all of his goods were confiscated by them and hauled back to Switzerland. And so many of the Duke of Burgundy's belongings are in museums or church treasuries, actually, intact in Switzerland. And one of those was a gorgeous carving set. So beautiful. Oh, Takeda, you should see this thing. It's just the bonework, the inlay in the handles is so gorgeous. And they're different blades for different purposes. And there's even a serving knife that's beautiful and broad and flat. So this dressing knife, I'm pretty certain, is a carving knife. And in medieval Europe, this is true in everywhere, most places in medieval Europe where there were princes or kings or noblemen, is that the noblemen would learn how to carve at table. Part of their learning growing up as a page in another household was to learn how to carve meat and serve their lord, because there was always a hierarchy in the Middle Ages. If you were a duke, you served a king. If you were a count, you served a duke, right? Everyone served someone, and so you had to learn proper table service. Even kings, as pages, growing up as princelings, usually in other households often, they would also learn how to carve so they could properly carve and serve at table. It was a fine art, and it is described in detail in books like John Russell's Book of Caring from the 1460s. So we actually know, we can reenact how medieval table service worked step by step with 100% accuracy based on etiquette manuals like that. And so here we have a dressing knife, a serving knife in Sir John Fastolf's kitchen, which tells us that part of his table service was carvery. So this also illustrates that he was on the upper end of the middling sort, if not at the lower end of the gentry, but that he still adhered to those kinds of rituals that were part of upper level households. Do I know roughly when cauldrons fell out of use? Common use? I'm going to say probably in the 19th century. I think cauldrons probably fell out of common use in the transition from the 19th to the 20th century when stoves, the modern range was invented. I'm pretty certain that's probably when it happened, because they're still using them in many kitchens until the end of the 19th century. So I'm pretty certain it has to do with the stove. That's when they just all became pots like we have now. Pretty certain. That's my conjectural response anyway. I want this hunting butcher's kit. It's a dark horn handle complete with the carry box with all the pieces as well as a folding saw. Wow, that sounds gorgeous. Is it an extant one from the Middle Ages or from a different period, Takeda? That sounds beautiful. Okay, so moving on from our dressing knife, a fire shovel, which we still have, those of you who have fireplaces, anyone, you still have some of these tools. You still have tongs, you still have a poker, and you still have a fire shovel, right? Same, used for the same reason. So a fire shovel would especially be used when you want to bank your embers, right? When you actually want to put ash on top of your embers to bank them, to tamp them down, which is not necessarily to put them out. It's often in the Middle Ages, they didn't want the embers to go out because they wanted to be able to start the fire very easily the next day rather than to have to go through the trouble of flint and steel from scratch. So they would actually bank the embers, cover them in ash to basically protect them. They would put a curfew on top. Curfew is actually a couvre-feu from the French. That word becomes curfew. And they were often, it was a giant ceramic bowl basically with a handle on top. And you would put the curfew over the embers, and then you could uncover the embers the next day and get them started again, basically. Yep. Would a low-class Renaissance person think a pioneer life in America was uncivilized? Probably. I mean, lower class, talking about on the lower end of this, lower income household in, say, in 15th century Italy, probably would have thought that, you know, let's say 19th century life on the Western frontier in the US was probably pretty uncivilized. Quite possibly. Because what do you mean you don't have butchers and tanners and bakers to do these things for you? What do you mean there's no secondhand markets where I can go buy the cast-offs of my betters? Yeah, actually, probably. Because contrary to popular belief, even at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum in the 15th century, you know, life was still, society was very specialized, and there were markets that catered to a variety of levels. And yeah, I think they probably would have viewed it as uncivilized to a certain degree. Yeah. I've kept the same fire going for 10 or 12 days. Yep. Yep. Jim, how did you do? What was your technique, Jim? I'm curious to hear. A comparison video like that would be so interesting, comparing different socioeconomic classes and different time periods. Yeah, that would, Catherine. Yeah, it would actually. Maybe it's something I would put together as a live stream. I don't really do horizontal footage anymore. It's not worth it. YouTube does not push my horizontal content. It never really has. It doesn't earn me very much money. My last horizontal video on medieval rings got like 800 views. So unfortunately, it's just, and I mean, I've got 20,000+ subscribers and none of my subscribers really watched it. So it's not really worth it to me to do that very labor intensive horizontal content anymore. It takes 100 hours to produce a video like that, to do all the research, to script, to record, to edit, and do all the nice cuts and put in all the imagery. It's not worth it. It's 100 hours of work that ends up earning me about $0.01 an hour. So yeah. Let me see. A buckskinning in the Western US was uncivilized. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, moving back to the 15th century to 1432, Sir John Falstaff's kitchen. 2 trays. Trays were used for service. It was, you know, very common. So this also gives us an idea, again, that Sir John Falstaff obviously had a proper table service. Now, maybe he didn't do that for every meal, but maybe, could be. He had 2 great spits, or 2 great square spits and 2 square spits. And it's interesting that they distinguish between the great one and the not great one. And I will be perfectly honest, I was not able to find out what a square spit versus another kind of spit was. But I will tell you that in the depictions of spits that I've seen from the 15th century, I'm not certain if I've seen a square one versus a regular one. But in general, a spit in this case is what many of you might think of as a rotisserie, right? But it's manual. So there's a long iron bar with a handle on it, and it rests on two dog irons or iron dogs, and then you turn it slowly, and there's a roast of meat that's impaled on it, and as you turn it, the fire beneath or the coals beneath, you know, slowly cook it in that wonderful slow roasted method. And for most kitchens in the Middle Ages anyway, that spit was turned by hand. There was some poor bastard, the spit boy, whose job it was to turn the spit by hand slowly, and that puts them right next to the fire. It's a hot and sweaty job. And sometimes in large kitchens, you would have very long spits indeed, and you would put like 8 to 10 fowl on them or poultry on them. You can't really tell what they are in the pictures because it's just a headless bird with no feathers. So it could have been duck or geese or chickens, right? But I've seen multiple birds being slow roasted at one time, and then you'd have a long dripping pan underneath to catch all of those delicious drippings. Yep. Yeah, Charles the Rash. Oh, yeah, this the set of Charles the Bold. It is beautiful. Charles the Rash. Yeah, yeah. Let me see. It is odd since most extant spits are square, since you want to have spit keys or forks to prevent the meat from turning on the spit itself. Yeah, it's. I don't know why. I'm not certain what a non-square spit is. So, if you have any ideas as to what a non-square spit could be, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Yeah, random headless bird. I mean, so let me be frank. In many places in the world, it is actually the law that you have to leave the head on the animal at the grocery store. By which I mean, in Italy, it used to be anyway. I don't know if it still is. The first time I went to Italy, I was shocked at all the chickens and ducks and geese that still had their heads and their paws or their feet. And then it was explained to me, this is so that you can't scam customers into believing they're buying a duck when they're really buying a chicken, or, that they're buying a turkey when they're really buying a goose or something like that. So you leave the head and the feet on as proof of existence, basically, as proof of concept. So, once you remove their heads and their feet, they get a lot more homogeneous looking. If you're just looking at a depiction in a picture. Yeah. Maybe an unsquare spit is more like a cone-shaped ones used to make pork in Mexico. It could be. I don't know if I've ever seen a depiction of one like that, but that would definitely be an interesting rabbit hole to fall down into and then not actually get anything done that I meant to get done that day. Were swans and pheasants cooked on spits? They were. Swans and pheasants were also spit roasted. Most meat was spit roasted. If it wasn't boiled, it was spit roasted because oven roasting wasn't a thing in this era. And if it's whole, then you can't really fry it in a pan, right? So most meat was either spit roasted, boiled, or chopped up into its constituent pieces, and then either boiled or fried, or just fried, or just boiled. But if it was left whole, then it was spit roasted. There's no oven roasting in this era. Not really, anyway. Not in Europe. Not in Europe. I should specify not in Europe, because in Persia in this era, they have basically what are tandoor ovens. They have the equivalent of tandoor ovens, and they would actually hang roast meat in those tandoor ovens. But we don't have those. I've never seen any evidence of such an oven for roasting meat in Europe. And all of the recipes talk about spit roasting or frying in a pan or boiling. Yep. Or some combination, actually, sometimes. Yep. I wonder if them referencing a square spit is the kind that would carry several smaller spits, so that could roast many smaller game birds or small cuts of meat on a single turning spindle. That could be spit roasting. So to answer, spit roasting is basically like what we would call rotisserie now, right? So spit roasting is where you have a long metal bar, usually iron, and you actually put your roast, you skewer your roast on the bar, right? And then it goes on two dog irons, more or less, and then it's got a handle, and you slowly turn it. So roasting is just like anytime you apply heat or fire to meat directly without water, that's roasting. Spit roasting is when it goes on a spit and you slowly turn it. That's a good question, Eric. Yeah, maybe. Takeda, maybe these two great square spits and two square spits. Yeah, maybe it's multiple spits could be on the same device. I don't know if I've ever seen a depiction of that from the 15th century or earlier, but might be. Yep. Okay, so one brass sieve. So sieves and strainers are, you're going to laugh when I say this, a polemic topic in the medieval culinary world. This stupid shit, excuse my language, that people feel the need to absolutely die, oh my God. So there are people who believe that they didn't have sieves like we have in the modern world with the fine wire, with a fine mesh. Now, I have not seen evidence of wire mesh from this era for sieves, but I have seen evidence for horsehair mesh, which is pretty damned good at doing the job. I have also seen extant the kinds of sieves that are called here. A brass sieve, the ones I've seen are actually basically sheet brass that has been hammered into a kind of bowl like thing. And then it has holes punched through it. Lots of holes, lots of holes, lots and lots and lots of holes. And that would work really well for sieving foods, for actually pressing sauce through it to make it finer, to make it creamier, as often is the case in these recipes. The brass sieves could also be used for filtering wine, and often were, because wine in this era, it doesn't come pre-filtered. It comes not filtered, and apparently a lot of people didn't necessarily like the chunks in their wine. So they would actually often filter the wine, and sometimes if it was spiced wine, then you would actually filter the wine after the spices had steeped in it. And so this brass sieve could have been used for a multitude of things. But the brass sieves I have seen from this era are basically metal bowls, in this case brass, so a sheet of brass that has been hammered out into a bowl shape, and then lots of little holes poked into it. That is the form of brass sieve I have seen. If you have evidence of other kinds of brass sieve, for example, if you actually have evidence of a brass wire sieve from the 15th century or earlier, I would be super interested in that bit of evidence. Oh, can you tell me how hygiene for men and women was back in those days? I have so many videos on hygiene on this channel. That is actually not part of today's discussion. But if you look up hygiene or washing on this channel after this live stream, you will find lots of videos where I dive into medieval hygiene and I demonstrate medieval hair washing. I demonstrate a wide array of aspects of medieval daily life, like hygiene specifically. I have lots of videos on that topic. That's not really part of today's topic, but in short, I will tell you that medieval people cared about being clean just as much as modern ones do, and with the same level of variety. Just like today, not everyone brushes their teeth all the time. Not everyone showers or bathes every day or washes themselves every day. Not everyone, you're going to hate me when I say this, but we all know it's true. Not everyone changes their underpants every day. And I know you all know, you know it. You know, we all have that relative, right? We all have that relative. So the same thing applies in the Middle Ages. In general, medieval people cared very much about being clean and sweet smelling. Did everyone apply the same standards of hygiene? No, just like today. Not everyone does. And depending on where you are in the world today, you may or may not care that much about being super duper clean. You might want to, but you might not have the time to. Same thing in the Middle Ages. Things haven't really changed. They cleaned their faces, they cleaned their bodies, they brushed their teeth, they cleaned them with a cloth, they didn't have brushes. They combed their hair, they washed it, seems every 3 weeks was about the regular rate of hair washing. They took a bath once a week at the public bathhouses on average. And in between, they used a basin of water to clean the important parts of their body. And they started their day generally by washing their face and hands and brushing their teeth and freshening their breath. So yeah, general overview. If you don't know that one person, you're that one person. Love it. I'm stealing that. Okay, back to the sieve. Horsehair will hold up a house. I'm sure it can strain some PS. Yes, it can, Brian. Horsehair is amazing. It is a fantastic material, and it was widely available in the Middle Ages. If any of you have worked with horses, you know their hair falls out all the time. You give their tails a comb, and you get lots of hair, just like humans. Lots of hair comes out. It was a very available material in the Middle Ages because there were more horses then than there were now. And they made a lot of things out of horsehair, many practical applications for horsehair. So horsehair sieves, I've been desperately trying to find a nice horsehair or any horsehair sieve, nice or otherwise, and I've been unable to find them. The only thing I can find here in Korea, for those who don't know, I'm currently in South Korea, the only thing I can find here are sadly synthetic horsehair sieves, and I think we all know what that's code for. That's code for nylon. Right. Yeah. So nylon is what replaced horsehair, which should tell you something about horsehair. But I want a horsehair sieve, not a nylon sieve. Still looking, hoping to find one. Okay. So moving on from sieves. well, moving on for now, because we're going to get back to another sieve. 1 brass mortar and 1 pestle. So mortar and pestle, for those who don't know, if you've ever seen the typical apothecary or pharmacy shop or chemist shop symbol, the what looks like a bucket with a rod in it, that's a mortar and pestle. They are used for grinding. And if my condottiero would here, I would have him bring my crazily comic mortar and crazily comically sized pestle to show you. But this is what I've been telling you. They had brass mortars and pestles in the Middle Ages. Well-heeled households had metal ones, and I really want a metal one because the giant granite one we have is 32 pounds, and it weighs so much to try to pick it up and pour things out of it. I'm always worried I'm going to drop it and smash the counter. But these would have been big. The mortar's the bowl component, would have been big, and it would have sat on the ground based on the image we have. And the pestle would have been body sized. And you would have stood above it, and you would have actually, like churning butter, you would have put the full force of your body into grinding items. And the mortar and pestle is the medieval food processor. It slices, it dices, it crushes everything. Okay, maybe it doesn't slice and dice. I'm just referencing those old stupid Ginsu knife commercials, infomercials from the bad old days, right? But if you take a knife and a cutting board and the mortar and pestle, that's really all you need in a medieval kitchen. Sieves are nice, and you can use them for a lot of things for which you might use a mortar and pestle, but really the mortar and pestle is the quintessential medieval food processor. And one out of brass, that would have been a real luxury item. So Sir John Fastolf, definitely a wealthy man, at least some level of wealth, 100%. Because they also, on the cheaper end of the spectrum, you had ceramic mortars, not ceramic pestles so much, usually wood then, or wooden ones, also then wooden pestles. But this man has 1 brass mortar. But here's the interesting thing. 1 brass mortar, so the mortar is brass, but it only says 1 pestle. The pestle might therefore not be brass. The pestle might actually be wood. And honestly, if it's a really big pestle, I don't want a giant brass pestle. That might be too heavy to actually use. A giant wooden pestle is heavy enough and will still get the job done. Right. Okay, let me see. Mortar and pestle day is replacing arm day at the gym. Yep, that's right. In functional fitness. You know how functional fitness has become a big thing in modern gyms these days, modern fitness studios? So just imagine that now they add a giant medieval mortar and pestle to the functional fitness section. Oh my God. Oh, whew, so fun. I need a new granite pestle. I don't need a 30-pound one. Yeah, Brian, I will tell you, it's heavy. Big ones are heavy. My aunt has a grapefruit-sized stone mortar and pestle, which I keep threatening to steal. Yeah, Captain Real, I have smaller ones as well. But I'll tell you, having the big one with the giant pestle, it's completely transformed my medieval cooking life. Functional fitness, the mortar and pestle. Oh my God. Mortar and pestle brass, how do they clean it? Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't. So for certain, they use salt very often to clean kitchen implements. Salt and water was a very common thing. Now, I don't know, because I haven't thought about this, what impact salt, so sodium chloride in this case, would have on brass. But Takeda, if you're there, can you maybe chime in on what if salt would have been a good method, if it could have been a method of cleaning things, cleaning brass implements, for instance, or what your best practices would be for cleaning brass implements, for instance. Yeah. Thank you. This is my red linen kirtle. We don't actually really have evidence of linen kirtles having been a thing, so it's very conjectural. But we're getting towards summer again, so I've broken out the linen also because I was tired of always wearing the blue kirtle. So yeah, this is actually, in terms of fit, this is my favorite one. I plan on actually taking this apart and using it to make exact replicas, because unfortunately I made this pattern, but I don't know where the pattern actually went. So this is the only survivor of that patterning. And I made this 13 years ago. So I'm going to actually just take this one apart and lay it out and use it as a pattern because it's actually completely self-supporting and it fits perfectly and the arms, eyes are perfect and I have really great range of motion despite it being a very fitted garment. So that's the plan, is to take this apart and lay it out and use it as a pattern. It's literally wearing out anyway. And I mean, the linen is dying. I won't even be able to patch it again soon. I mean, let's see if I did the patch under there. You can see the lining is now showing through, right? So yeah, it is on its last legs. I will wear it until I can wear it no more, but yeah. Let me see. Brian says, brass is resistant to salt water, so it should be all right with polishing. Great. Okay. Takeda says salt can clean brass. If you do not wipe it clean after, it can spread corrosion due to the salt acting as a catalyst for oxidation. I was worried about that, but medieval cleaning techniques were to scrub out with salt and then rinse and then put in the sun for some good UV treatment, was generally when there was sun. Places like Ireland and England, that could vary from day to day or week to week. Yep. I'm going for a medieval BLT myself. Did they have bacon in the 1400s? No. So they didn't have bacon like we understand it, right? Bacon now is this soft, tender, fatty, smoked meat that's been cured with a very specific combination of spices and brown sugar very often. They didn't have that kind of bacon in the Middle Ages. They had hard smoked meat. If meat was smoked for preservation, it was salted and then it was smoked to dry, and it was smoked until it became jerky. So that's how and I have no evidence of the kind of cured bacon that we have now. I have zero evidence for that in the Middle Ages. I have evidence of hard smoked sausage. I have recipes. For hard smoked sausage, like Genoa salami, like that kind of sausage. Summer sausage, we would call that. I've got several recipes in the Neapolitan recipe collection. It's a lot of salt, by the way, but I've never seen any evidence for what we call bacon now existing in the Middle Ages. And the problem is that sometimes people will stumble across a word in the sources that's bacon, and they don't understand how etymology works and how something being called the thing in the 15th century nearly never means that it's the same thing with the same word in the 21st century. So no, it would have been smoked meat, seems to have been really salted and then smoked until it was dried, like jerky. And then they would use it for cooking. They would rehydrate it. And there are actually recipes that talk about if you use salted meat, you don't need to add salt to this recipe. Or if you use salted meat, you have to boil it to rehydrate it and remove the excess salt and then use it for the rest of your recipe. So sorry, no bacon and no tomato. You could do the L. No bacon, no tomato in the Middle Ages, but you have lettuce. You could do the L. You could have an L. Yeah. Let me see. I use coarse salt to clean my cast iron sometimes. Yeah, I do too, especially if it's really, if my cast iron needs reseasoning anyway, and so it wasn't as nonstick as it should be. Yeah, so the armpit gussets really are one of the best ways to give yourself good range of motion. Also, sometimes gussets on the side front or the side back are another great way for range of motion. But the underarm gussets allow you to have this nice fit, right? So you can have it fitted in the upper arm, and then it widens out perfectly into that underarm area, which is really great for this era of clothing when the gowns, the overdress, has really, really fitted sleeves, because you want your kirtle then to also have very, very fitted sleeves and still, have pretty good range of motion. Right. Yep. Okay. When did we start eating tomatoes? Oh, yeah. So guys, Columbian Exchange, Turbo Columbian Exchange lesson. Okay, so tomatoes, potatoes, corn, chili peppers, green beans, vanilla, chocolate are all from the Americas. They do not come to Africa, Europe, and or Asia until at the earliest, they don't arrive in Spain until the tail end of the 15th century. Columbus brings some of those items over, not the chocolate. But mostly they don't actually take root into cuisine, European, African, and or Asian cuisine for the most part until the 18th century. Europeans don't start eating them until the 18th century. They thought they were toxic. Europeans avoid potatoes for the most part too, because they thought they were toxic. Because like dumbasses, they ate the green part and threw out the root, the tuber, the potato. And the green part is toxic and will make you very, very sick. And unfortunately, the first introduction of potatoes, real introduction of potatoes to England, was under Elizabeth I towards the end of the 16th century when God, was it Sir Francis Drake or the other one? God, his name, there's a block in front of his name. It starts with an R. Anyway, he brings potatoes. He brings potato plants, and he hands them to the head cook, and he tells them to prepare these. Well, the cooks did what they usually do at that time, and they apparently cut off the roots and threw them away, and they've prepared the green stalks like those were the vegetable, and everyone got super sick. And so word spread that potatoes were a poisonous plot by the Catholics to try to kill the English. And it's even in the 18th century in England, there is still anti-potato propaganda that ties potato eating to being Catholic. And as a Catholic conspiracy to poison the English. So yeah, tomatoes don't start getting eaten in Europe until the 18th century, and in fact, in most parts of not the Americas until the 18th century. Yeah, sorry. Not medieval. Raleigh, thank you, Takeda Raleigh. God, I don't know why I've got a block on his name. I keep trying to say Sir Roanoke because of his failed colony. God, Jesus. Or Raphael. Don't know where that's come from because that's certainly not Raleigh. Oh, thank you, Sir Raleigh. I've had a block on his name for a month now. Whew. The Cooking with History guy did a video following an old hot chocolate recipe, and man, it looked decadent. So original hot chocolate was actually not that, was thicker than we might understand it, but it wasn't sweet at all, and it had dried chili pepper in it. So yeah, the original Aztec hot chocolate was nothing like chocolate now, and it's Europeans added sugar to it maybe in the end of the 17th century, but I'm thinking more like the 18th century. But it was it was, you know, in its point of origin, it was not a sweet drink. It was consumed more like coffee. Like it was more like that, you know, people appreciated that bitter, astringent nature to it. I think most people now, if you gave them Aztec style hot chocolate, they would spit it out probably. Because one, they would be expecting super sweet and they wouldn't be expecting super bitter. And they also might not be expecting the chili pepper. Yeah. It looked like warm, delicious sludge, but in a delicious way. So if you go to Spain or you go to Mexico and some other places in the Hispanic world, and you get chocolate con chorros, that will be, the chocolate will be like sludge, but it will also be sweet. And it is decadent. It's like eating, I mean, it's like eating fudge, liquid fudge basically, but a little bit less sweet and more chocolatey. Really tasty stuff. Yep. Okay. Yeah, everyone, if you're enjoying this medieval storytime live stream, then do double tap that screen and consider subscribing. Okay, back to our food, back to our kitchen. We are currently going through the items in the kitchen of Sir John Fastolf, who, this is an inventory of his kitchen from 1430. Sir John Falstaff was a member of the gentry and a relatively well-heeled one because of the kinds of items that he has in his kitchen. So we were just up to the wooden sieve or colander. So this is interesting. I have not seen an extant wooden sieve or colander. So I can only imagine that this may have in fact been a turned bowl, because they had lathes, foot-driven lathes, that are very efficient at producing very nice turned wood in the 15th century. And I've actually seen, I have several friends who have reproduced these. Takeda, have you also reconstructed a medieval lathe? I have several friends who have recreated medieval lathes with foot driven with a bow, and they produce really beautiful objects, really quite lovely. And so I could imagine this wooden sieve could be a turned bowl that then has holes drilled into it. And they had drills. They had bow-driven drills, in fact, so a kind of power drill, just not electrical power. But they, took advantage of mechanics to actually use a bow to help drive the drill to increase the strength of, of the drill itself and the force that could be applied by a human body. So yeah, I could imagine a wooden sieve or a colander would be that. And why would they have this? Well, they very often, very, very often, vegetables were parboiled and then they had to be drained. And so you would just dump your parboiled vegetables into the sieve. But there are actually pasta, was not introduced to Europe by Marco Polo, sorry, predates him by a long shot. And pasta is a medieval thing. Pasta with tomato sauce, not medieval, not even slightly. But pasta, just meaning flour and dough and maybe egg mixed together and turned into a paste, rolled out and cut into shapes and then cooked, absolutely very popular across all of Europe. Lozenges, lasagna, the original lasagna recipe actually started in Italy and then it spread all over Europe, was layers of thin foil of pasta, it's usually called, layered between cheese and cinnamon and other sweet spices, and then cooked together like that in a pot, basically. So that was the original, basically Dutch oven baked is maybe the best modern comparison for how that dish would have been prepared. So that's the original lasagna. But that very often they talk about boiling the pasta first. And we know for a fact that in 15th century England, especially in the upper crust households like Sir John Falstaff, they were eating lozenges. So it could be that this sieve was used to drain the noodles, basically. Right, amongst other things. So there's a wide array of dishes from the 15th century in England for which a wooden sieve, or call it colander, as it's spelled here, would have been a very useful item to have in your kitchen. Let me see. What date does pasta start? I don't have, so I'll answer a couple of questions here. I don't actually have a proper start date for pasta, but I can trace it back to at least the 13th century in Europe, but something in my brain is telling me that the Romans had pasta as well. I haven't looked at Apicius in quite a while, or some of the other recipes that have survived from the ancient Roman Empire, but something in my brain is telling me that there's a reference to it in Apicius and or a recipe for it. If you think about it, it's not hard. Bread, it's unleavened bread, basically. Right? It's flour and water and maybe some egg, and you mix it together and you roll it out and you boil it. It's one of those dishes that is super basic and that could easily follow on from bread making. So and for all I know, they might have had it in places like ancient Babylonia. Noodles in Asia go back, I think, at least 2,000 years. So, but if you're talking about in Europe, in the European part of the Eurasian continent, there is something in my brain that's telling me that the Romans had it. And something in my brain, some memory is also trying to crawl up about a Babylonian mention of it. But that's all me. I haven't looked into the actual origins. I just know that in the Middle Ages it was very popular. And in the Italian sources, they have all kinds of recipes. They've got ravioli recipes out the wazoo. They've got instructions for how to make all kinds of pasta that you would recognize in your pasta aisle to this day. Yep. Okay, there was another good question here. Wait. For the drill bits, there was an oil question. There was, how prevalent was olive oil and how was it normally used? Very good question. Oil was very localized, and how prevalent depends on if you're in an olive oil producing region, such as Spain, such as Italy, Greece, Crete, right, Northern Africa. These all have been olive oil producing regions since the ancient Romans, at least, if not long before that, right? So I think it was the Romans who introduced olive oil agriculture to Spain, though, to Hispania at the time, I think. But those parts of medieval Europe, olive oil was prevalent. It was the common oil, right? But I mean, everything would have been more expensive than it is now, because everything was basically a hand product, an artisanal product. And there was some mechanization, but not lots of mechanization. So, everything cost more. So everything was more precious. Everything was more expensive than it is now, just out the get-go. So something like olive oil would have still, by most people, would have been used very carefully, would have been available to everyone more or less in medieval Mediterranean. But if you went up into places like France, northern France, England, Ireland, Scandinavia, any place north of the Alps, basically. Places like that, olive oil would have been a luxury imported item, and so probably more expensive. Right? Most people tended to use the oils that were local to them. So if you came from a place that was rich in walnut trees, then walnut oil might have been more common. Lamb tallow, rendered fat from beef, from lamb, from goats, lard, rendered fat from pigs. If any of those animals were very prevalent where you were, then those would be the prevalent cooking fats. And they don't necessarily distinguish between cooking fat and cooking oil. They very often don't. To them, oil is basically any fat that becomes liquid under heat. So the kind of cooking oil that would have been more prevalent or more used would depend on what kinds of vegetable and/or animal products were local and cheaply available. So olive oil doesn't actually make an appearance that often in, say, 15th century Italian recipes. Butter makes a more frequent appearance, interestingly. And there's an Italian gentleman in the 15th century who goes to Crete or Cyprus, one of those two islands, and he observes that they have really fatty cheese. He's actually referring to feta cheese because it's in brine and it's just really fat and it's much creamier than their cheeses are because they don't know how to make butter, he says. They don't know how to make butter. So they don't take the butter fat out of the cream to turn it into butter and then use the milk to make cheese. Their cheese is therefore fattier, and feta cheese is pretty damned rich and pretty damned creamy because he says they don't know how to make butter, which implies that back in Italy, they're making and using a lot of butter. And in fact, 15th century Italian recipes use butter really, really heavily, really, really much more. You are more likely to see butter as an ingredient, or butter or lard as an ingredient, than you are to see olive oil in 15th century Italian recipes. So I suspect they were using it more often for oil lamps and or as the cooking oil itself rather than as a seasoning, interestingly. Okay. Hold on a minute. There was another question available here. How available were eggs in the Middle Ages? Very available. Eggs were very, 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 very available. But it would depend on the season, and it would depend on where you were, whether they were available all year round. Right? If you go up into the north where it gets cold in the winter, the hens tend to stop laying in the winter. So, they would actually go with they would have fewer eggs in the winter than they would at other times of year. But eggs were something everyone could have some chickens, right? Eggs were something that everyone could afford to have. They were not a luxury item, especially chicken eggs. Now, maybe ostrich eggs, that was a luxury item. And ostrich eggs were, in fact, imported into 15th century Italy and eaten as eggs. I mean, can you imagine the omelet you can make from one ostrich egg? But yeah, eggs were very common, depending on the breed of chicken in question, depending on the weather, depending on the season, would determine how many eggs were available. But there were a lot of seasons where they wouldn't eat eggs because it was a period of fasting. And so they would actually have a huge supply of eggs by the end of the period of fasting. The Lenten fast, 40 days, is one of them, where they would have so many eggs saved up that, you'd suddenly have a whole bunch of dishes made with eggs. But eggs were not an expensive item. Eggs were a source of protein that everyone could afford. Because like I said, anyone and everyone could have a couple of chickens. Let me see. Lasagna baklava would be life-changing. Yeah, absolutely. What are some vegetables, some root vegetables they boiled more than once? Boiled more than once? That's hard to tell. I haven't really found recipes for root vegetables that are boiled more than once. They're at least boiled once, though. No matter what comes after most root vegetables, it's instructed that you should boil them first, even if it's just parboiling. And that's basically to sanitize them. But there aren't a lot of recipes that have survived for root vegetables were considered peasant food. So they don't need recipes written down in these expensive cookbooks, right? So it's harder to track the production of food for those on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum because they didn't tend to write collections of recipes the way wealthy head cooks did write collections of recipes for wealthy audiences. Would the drill bit be arrowhead shaped in this period? Yes. I'm thinking about the drill head bits that I've seen. The ones that I've seen in 15th century depictions of drill bits, I do believe they have arrowheads on them. Takeda, you can probably confirm. I'm thinking of the Zwölfbrüder Stiftung depictions of the men who did whose profession it was to, well, the sieve makers actually drilling holes in sieves. Okay, right. Let me see. We made butter in baby jars. I wish I remembered the recipe in elementary school. Oh, making butter in a baby jar is easy. You just put cream in a jar and you shake the living crap out of it. It will eventually turn into butter. Another way is to just like if you hang the jar around your neck and just wear it all day and walk around a lot, it will eventually turn your cream into butter. I mean, then you have to strain out the water, but that separates out naturally. Or the whey, sorry, the whey. You have to strain out the whey, but it will form naturally. I think he's talking about ceramics action. He's talking about glass jars. I think baby jars. They're baby food jars, I think is what he means. Yeah. Let me see. Yes, eggs were very, very highly eaten in the Middle Ages. One of the main sources of protein for everyone. When did chickens begin being farmed in Europe? I understand them to be from Asian fowl in origin. Yes, they are. So they're apparently an Asian jungle fowl is the origin of chickens, or actually it might be an African jungle fowl. It's a jungle fowl though. You are correct. But chickens, they came to Europe relatively early on. I don't have a real beginning date because I haven't looked back that far, but I know they had chickens in Europe for the entire Middle Ages, and I'm pretty certain they had chickens in the Roman Empire as well. So it's a long time ago. Jungle fowl were taken to Europe a long, long time ago. Jungle fowl in Asia in many places still look like dinosaurs, by the way. Ceramic action. He's not talking about glass jars from the Middle Ages. He's talking about something he did when he was in school. It's something in a lot of American schools that they actually have the kids do. They have them make jar butter. So they actually they reuse like baby jars from baby food. So he's not talking about medieval butter making. He's talking about something you do modernly in schools in the United States. No, you're absolutely right. They didn't. I have no evidence of. Okay, that's not true. The Romans had glass jars. The ancient Romans had glass jars. They had glass urns, in fact. And they had glass jars for very expensive toiletries and perfumes and things like that. So the Romans had glass jars. Did they have screw top lids? No, but they had glass jars. Yep. Did that continue into the Middle Ages? Not so much. I'm thinking. I can't really think of any glass jars from the Middle Ages, but the Romans had them in large quantities. What did the Romans ever do for us, right? If only we could remember more of what they did for us. Great Life of Brian reference. One of the best movies ever. Still relevant. So relevant. So very bloody relevant. It's horrifying. It shouldn't still be relevant, and yet it is. This is the worst timeline. Okay, back to our medieval kitchen. Great questions, everyone. Thanks for asking these fantastic questions. Okay, so we have our wooden sieve colander, which led to our conversation about pasta. And then we have one flesh hook. I have 3 flesh hooks, none of them here, sadly, so I can't show you what a flesh hook looks like, but I'll describe it. A flesh hook is like a long fire poker, but it has either 2 curved prongs on the end or 3 curved prongs on the end. And it is literally something that you would use to dig meat out of a pot when you were boiling meat. And you literally, it's got a wooden handle on the end, and you just fish that meat out, the hooks sink into the side of the meat, and you pull it out. So flesh hooks are a really important item in a medieval kitchen. And I do have 3 of them. And I have used them to do exactly that. Especially if it's a small pot on the ground, then you don't have to bend over. You just, standing up, you just dip that stick it into the pot, give it a turn, pull it out, put it on your platter. Done. Fantastic. Love flesh hooks. Oh, cassowaries are just monsters, not birds. Oh, wait, Brian, are you a Kiwi? Are you from New Zealand? A horror movie tool. They are a horror movie tool. I can't argue with that. You can buy replica flesh hooks, not fish hooks. You can absolutely buy, if you look up medieval flesh hook. Ryan, are you there? Can you tag some medieval flesh hooks in today's live stream? Yes, you can buy flesh hooks from people, sutlers who purvey replica medieval cooking equipment. So yeah, you can. In Germany, I bought one from it's been a long time ago, though. I don't even know if they're still in business, but you can. If you look up replica medieval flesh hook, you probably will take you to some providers. You can buy them. At medieval fairs, if there's a good blacksmith, then they often sell them there as well. Yep. Need a Jason Voorhees with a flesh hook. Halloween, medieval style. Oh, no, sorry. All Hallows Eve, medieval style. Oh, ceramic, did you just look up the flesh hook? It's real scary. It is a no joke device. In fact, I think there are some depictions, medieval depictions of hell, in which the devils are tormenting people with flesh hooks, and the people are in pots. I'm pretty certain that's a real memory I have. For those just joining, welcome to Medieval Storytime. We were actually reading The Kitchen Goods of Sir John Fastolf. Looks like we're not going to get very far today through our readings, so there'll be more readings for the next time. And we were just talking about the kitchen equipment, specifically the flesh hook. If you are enjoying this live stream, then please do double tap that screen and consider subscribing, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. No, not Kiwi, but I've seen them kick nearly through riot shields. Yeah, cassowaries are... Yeah, I wouldn't want to go toe-to-toe with a cassowary. No, that would be a losing battle. Yep. Old, but looks like you can get horsehair sieves in Kyoto. Not certain how accessible that is where you are from in Korea. I can fly to Kyoto, but I'll be frank, Kyoto is over touristed. I would only want to go to Kyoto if, I don't know, for whatever reason, no other tourists are there. It is crazy, crazy, crazy packed there. It's scary. I have a claustrophobia thing. So if crowds make me... I don't do crowds. I don't do crowds well at all. I need to feel like I can easily walk out of a space and not have to hip and shoulder check people to do so. Yes?
I found one.
You found one? Okay, everyone. In this live stream, if you click the little shopping bag that's
it should be tagged in the upper right hand corner.
Upper right hand corner, there is a flesh hook that is tagged. If you buy that flesh hook, that will support me. I will actually get a commission from you purchasing it.
Now, I don't know the maker. They have very few sales over 12 years.
Yeah, we know nothing. We know nothing about it. I cannot recommend it or not recommend it, but it is there. It looks nice. Who knows? Unfortunately, all the people from whom I've bought them over the years, they're all out of business now. So, yep. Okay, so flesh hook, one flesh hook. 2 pot hooks. Now, a pot hook is part of the suspension system for suspending what some of you might call a cauldron, but are just called pots in these sources, over a fire. And there was usually, and it's interesting because I don't see one referenced here. There's a whole pulley system for that. Strainer, pot hooks. So this pot hook could actually be referencing the whole pulley system. So in the 15th century, they actually have these very sophisticated ratchet pot hooks where you can actually adjust the height of the pot by, like on a ratchet strap, basically. You ratchet it and it lifts it, or you can release it and ratchet it down and it lowers the pot like one tooth at a time, step by step by step. So it's a metal suspension system from which you hang pots over the fire, and you can raise and lower the pot to increase or decrease the heat and thereby control the process of cooking inside the pot. So apparently he had 2 of these. And if you look at 15th century woodcuts from medieval kitchens, or especially woodcuts, you will most likely see one of these fantastic sets of pot hook systems. They're really great, but you are over the fire And so using them can be a little tricky and might expose you to more flames than you want. Which brings me to the topic of wool and why medieval people wore wool even and especially in the kitchen. Everyone in the modern world, we imagine wool as being this uncomfortably hot material. It is not always so, and it doesn't have to be so, depending on how it's woven. But what wool always is naturally flame retardant. And so medieval people in kitchens absolutely wore top layers of wool, under layers of linen, but top layers of wool because they wouldn't catch on fire. Wool, it not only is flame retardant, it will literally self-extinguish. Even if it catches on fire, it self-extinguishes. It won't keep burning. So that is why people who worked in kitchens wore wool, because they didn't want to catch on fire, because that would suck. So yeah, that would at least protect you, insulate you, and protect you somewhat when you would go to raise or lower the pot. Even still, I wouldn't want to be the poor person who got the assignment of raising or lowering the pot. That was no doubt not the head cook, by the way. The head cook had staff, they had people, they had scullions to do grunt work like raising and lowering pots. Yeah. Obviously, that's in an upper end kitchen. There are, of course, plenty of home cooks in the Middle Ages where it's, the lady of the house, the wife, and, her female relatives who basically handle all the cooking. But in the upper end households, the head cooks were most often men. And their scullions were most often men. Sometimes they would have female assistants in the kitchen. But when you really start looking at the staff of the kitchens in these great households, it skews very male heavy. Kids can do that for parents. Yeah, Etsy has some horsehair sieves, period incorrect, I'm certain. Yeah. So wearing wool. So here's the thing, guys. Wool does not have to be hot. It doesn't. The only wool most people know these days, wool sweaters, which are made of usually pretty coarse wool that's really scratchy. Wool blankets, which are woven to be intentionally hot because they're supposed to keep you warm. And also scratchy. They're not processed to be really fine, but you can weave wool to be like linen, to be as light as silk, to be as silky as silk. In fact, a lot of suit material that you might think is silk is not, it's wool. And that's not hot at all. It is not hot. It breathes really wonderfully in hot and humid conditions. It's perfect. It's the best fabric and it's flame retardant. So wool is not necessarily hot, and some wool is just as comfortable as linen is, and some is more comfortable. Yeah. So it depends on the weave. It's not the fiber, actually. It's the weave that will determine how warm wool is. Let me see. Tartan is more comfortable than a lot of weaves I felt for wool. Silk also burns funny. Yeah, silk does burn funny, doesn't it? Yeah. So tartan, just so everyone knows, tartan is not a weave. Tartan is a pattern. At least now it is. Tartan actually used to be in the Middle Ages was not wool at all. It was an expensive silk that was imported from the East, and it was called tartarin because it was associated with the Tatars, or the Tartars as they were called in medieval English. Got into an argument with someone who wouldn't listen to me about that topic once upon a time. And so tartarin was a fabric that was actually supposedly cotton in one direction. And it was I think the weft was cotton and the warp was silk. And so it was a silk cotton blend, and it was a very expensive fabric. But because it was a blend, it actually had that checkered, the striated pattern, because you had one kind of fiber in one direction and another in the other direction. And so it's thought that striation that was created by having these two different fibers in this luxury fabric is eventually why the word tartan comes to be used for fabric in that pattern. And then that kind of gets frozen in lowland Scots as being this wool that is patterned that way. But in the Middle Ages, tartan doesn't exist, at least not as such. And that word, it doesn't mean the same thing. Just putting that out there for those who are wondering. Food was worse for the rich. That's absolutely true. Yeah, food was definitely... The herringbone is the weave. Yep, the herringbone is the weave. It's not the material out of which it's made. Yeah. Food was worse for the rich. Actually, food was much less nutritious for the wealthy because they ate a diet very high in refined carbohydrates. They ate flour that had the bran bolted out of it, sifted out of it. So, and there was no fortified flour in that era, so there was really no micronutrient value either. So it was just basically refined wheat flour that turns to sugar in your mouth, because that's what saliva does to it, and becomes instantly accessible to your body and to your liver, and then gets turned into fat, right? And they ate lots and lots of protein, fish and meat, lots of cheese, lots of eggs. They were not eating lots of vegetables. Whereas on the lower ends of the socioeconomic spectrum, where people couldn't afford as much meat, although they did still get meat. Don't think medieval peasants didn't have a bad life, actually. They still ate meat, they just didn't eat as much. They ate more vegetables and pulses, and whole grain sourdough bread made not from wheat flour, which is pretty nutrient poor, but from rye flour, which is much more nutrient dense and much more digestible by the body, especially through the souring process. So the diets of the people on the lower socioeconomic end of the spectrum were actually more micro and macronutrient dense than those of their socioeconomic betters. The irony. Yeah. Yeah, the wealthy had lots of saturated fat meats and fish. Now, to be clear, saturated fat is not bad for you guys. It just isn't. It's the reason that saturated fat can be bad for you is because now we have factory farmed animals who eat terrible diets, and their saturated fat is unhealthy because of their diets. But medieval saturated fats were very, very healthy because those animals were all pasture raised, and they ate the things they're supposed to eat. They ate grass, they ate fodder. The pigs ate, foraged in the forest, for instance. That's how pigs were fed. They weren't fed disgusting slop, right? So the saturated fat from animals who actually eat what they're supposed to eat and live the way they're supposed to live, that's really good for us, because literally humans evolved to eat saturated fat, and we ate nothing very high saturated fat diets for tens of thousands of years before the agricultural revolution. Saturated fat is not the enemy. Sugar is the enemy. Refined carbohydrates are the enemy. Processed food is the enemy. Factory farmed meat is absolutely dangerous, but medieval people didn't have that. That wasn't a thing back then. So it wasn't so much the saturated fat that was the issue. It was the fact that they were eating very little in the terms of vegetables. And they ate a lot of bread. Wealthy people ate a lot of bread, and they ate a lot of white bread. A lot of white bread. So that's part of the problem. Their sauces were also thickened with bread. Medieval rich people, almost all of the sauce recipes from the cookbooks of the wealthy are thickened with white bread. So not only did they eat white bread just as an accompaniment, as part of the meal, they ate it in their sauces, which they ate on top of meat and fish, and they didn't eat lots of root vegetables or pulses. They ate some. It's not that they didn't eat any, don't mistake me. But the ratio of meat and bread, refined wheat bread, to vegetables was not balanced. Yep. Let me see. Did they have vegans or people that had a moral objection to certain foods? They didn't have. So medieval Christians had to fast in 130 plus days of the year. That was part of the traditional Christian calendar, that on certain days of holy observance or in certain periods like Lent and Advent, you would fast. And fasting meant no meat, no fish, fish, no meat, no eggs, no cheese. Basically no animal products. But fish was okay, because apparently the reason they weren't supposed to eat dairy products, animal products, and land animals is because those animals had sex to reproduce, and consuming those foods on these holy days of observance would imbalance your humors and make you more prone to lust. But fish, they didn't understand fish reproduction. Fish and seafood didn't have sex to reproduce. So that was okay. Also, they're cold in nature, and that's not going to inspire lust, right? The four humors is a thing in medieval nutritional theory. So there are actually a lot of recipes that are vegan in medieval cookbooks, because they're designed to be eaten during these Lenten periods. So for instance, they had vegan butter made from almond milk, but not like we call almond butter now, where it's ground almonds that are just turned into a paste. No. They actually would make almond milk, and then they would cause it to congeal by adding things like pike broth, because fish broth has the proteins in it that will coagulate. And so by adding the fish broth to the almond milk, it would actually cause it to coagulate overnight. And then they would strain it, just like straining cheese or yogurt, and make a lump of almond milk that was spreadable, almond butter. Lots of recipes for this, actually. And they had a lot of dishes that have a Lenten version, which means no butter, no meat in it. Lots of root vegetable dishes, lots of vegetable dishes that way. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of vegan recipes from the medieval cookbooks, not necessarily because of the objection to the ethical treatment of animals, but to the objection that we can't eat something that had sex to reproduce because it might make us want to have sex when we're not supposed to be having sex. Because during those Lenten periods, people were supposed to abstain from sexual intercourse. So if you're eating foods that make you lusty, then that's going to make it harder to abstain from sexual intercourse. So imagine 130 days of the year plus when you're supposed to abstain from sexual intercourse. Obviously, not everyone abided by these strictures. Obviously, there were backsliders. Obviously, just like today, there are people who interpret such rules liberally. And then you have confession, and you confess that you ate meat when you shouldn't have, or that you had sex on Good Friday when you or not Good Friday, on Friday, an Ember Day, when you shouldn't have, right? But still, it was there. So yeah. My hat. Anyone know? Anyone remember? So this is called a couvre-chef in French, or a kerchief in English. But those terms don't apply to this specific kind. There is no term for this specific kind. A couvre-chef or a kerchief is just a piece of fabric that you wrap around your head in some way to cover your hair and to keep the sun off of it and keep the dirt out, right? So there is no term for this specific kind. It's just the word for it is a kerchief or a couvre-chef. Yep. Let me see. The hat is not religious. No, this is a practical head covering. It's got nothing I'm wearing is religious. This is all daily wear. We know that women across all levels of society wore and owned these in the 15th century, but noble women wouldn't have been seen wearing this out of their own private chambers. This would have been something they would have worn when they were relaxing in their own chambers, maybe with some of their closest damsels, right? This is what you're seeing here is noblewoman Lululemon that I wouldn't wear outside. Just like you shouldn't really wear Lululemon out of the yoga studio. No judgment. You shouldn't wear, a noblewoman would not go dressed outside like this unless she were purposefully cosplaying a shepherdess, right? But shepherdesses wore outfits like this all the time. Artisans, women who are artisans engaged in dirty work wore this all the time. It's just a way to keep the dirt out of your hair. When it's hot outside, we're back. When it's hot outside, it keeps the sun off of your head. When it's cold outside, it actually insulates and helps keep you warm. I can put this brim forward, and then it actually keeps the glare out of my eyes. I know it doesn't look like it covers very much of my face, but it's actually enough to keep the glare out of my eyes. And I don't need sunglasses unless it's, in the desert and it's terribly bright. But in normal levels of sunlight, this is actually enough to mean that I don't really need sunglasses anymore. So yeah, it's a practical garment. It's got no religious application whatsoever. It is a secular fashion garment. And they stayed in use in the secular world. Women wore this exact kind of kerchief until the 18th century, not as a religious item of clothing. Yep. So yeah, good questions, everyone. Okay, does this count as asking if you're Amish? I don't know. Maybe, I think it was a genuine question, so no, there was no assumption of Amishness. Fish spawn like trees. Yeah, Brian, I didn't say that they had the right idea. Yes, absolutely, fish spawn like crazy. It is sexual reproduction, but that medieval people literally didn't see it, so they didn't think it was happening. I know, and you know. I didn't say it was correct science. Yeah. But in the medieval period, there were large periods of Lenten fasting, right? It's just lots of fasting, 130 plus days. It's part of the standard proof. Not Not okay. So couvre-chef means something that covers your head. A kerchief is a is basically from couvre-chef we get the word kerchief, and then eventually kerchief gets that word gets repurposed into a piece of fabric in various contexts. So a hand kerchief is a piece of cloth that you keep in your hand for various purposes, including patting your brow, including blowing your nose. But the word kerchief comes from couvre-chef originally, meaning something that covers your head. And men and women wore them originally. Kerchiefs wasn't just a woman thing. Yep. Gold star for effort, those medieval people. Yeah, Miss Scarlett. Also, welcome back. Yeah. Gold star for effort. I mean, it's not, the Middle Ages was scientific. No one should think otherwise. It was not an era of superstition. And in fact, the church condemned superstition. But the science on which their logic was based was not entirely correct. But they had a science. It was based on the four humors, a humoral understanding of the universe, which dates back, which covers all of Eurasia, by the way, China as well, and dates back thousands of years. The humoral theory, right, it's at least 2,000 years old, if not older. And so medieval scientific thought was based on the humoral theory, and they applied that science of humoral theory to everything, right? That's how they understood the universe. It wasn't just random superstitions, it was scientific. It just wasn't our modern concept of science, but that doesn't make it unscientific. It was not random. It was not illogical. It was very logical. Just the basis of the logic has been proven since to be not quite right. Right. So it's the science. Everyone thinks that science automatically means that you're right. That's not science. You need to come to a different understanding of science if that's what you think it means. Yeah. Let me see. So modern bandanas are used in the same manner as both today. Exactly. And that's a kerchief. That is a modern bandana. That's a great parallel, Brian. Thank you. A bandana is a kerchief. And they are still used exactly with that level of flexibility to this day. You can tie it around your head in a variety of ways to keep the sun off. You can use it to blot the sweat off of your head. You can use it to blow your nose and then maybe hopefully not put it back on your head. But, to each their own. No judgment here. Let me see. Do you think Edgar Allan Poe understood the Middle Ages? Probably not. Most Victorians did not understand the Middle Ages. Most people in the Victorian era, I mean, Edgar Allan Poe is technically American, but most, he's from Baltimore. He's from my part of the world, in fact. But most people in the 19th century had horrible misconceptions about the Middle Ages, and they wanted to, because they didn't want to believe that their era was actually not the best time in human civilization, which it wasn't. It was one of the more terrible times in human civilization, in fact. So, I highly doubt that Edgar Allan Poe had an accurate understanding of the Middle Ages either. I say I doubt because I haven't read any of his writings that were just, his musings about things like the Middle Ages, but it's unlikely that he had a good understanding. Most people in the 19th century didn't. Yeah. Let me see. This is also reminding me of that one medieval garlic recipe that scientists relatively recently found that kills MRSA. Yep. And so even though medieval science is based on the four humors, medieval people also absolutely allowed for the value of cause and effect observation, of observational science, and applying the learnings from that observational science going forward. For instance, it was observed that if you boiled vegetables before cooking them and eating them, just even parboiling them, people didn't get sick. Why would they have gotten sick? Because one of the primary fertilizers in the medieval European world was night soil. Night soil is human waste, is human excrement specifically. And gong farmers would actually go to people's septic tanks. Most homes had septic tanks. They didn't just poop in a pot and toss it out the window, contrary to popular belief. They had septic tanks in their homes, actually, and they would dispose of their waste materials in that very often. And a gong farmer was someone who would go and clean out the septic tank for them, just like today, except the gong farmer in the Middle Ages had a wheelbarrow and a shovel. But the gong farmer would get paid to clean out their septic tanks, and then he would go and sell what he had cleaned out to farmers to use as fertilizer. It's a very effective fertilizer, apparently, but it comes with big health risks. Medieval people figured out that if you boiled your vegetables first, the outcomes were better. No, they didn't understand microbiology. No, they didn't understand germ theory, but they understood that boiling the vegetables first meant better outcomes later. They understood that scrubbing kitchen equipment and implements with salt and putting it in the sun led to better outcomes. People didn't get sick when you then cooked with those items. No, they didn't have microbiology, no germ theory, but they understood cause and effect. And so even in the face of humoral theory countering the cause and effect, they would still go with the cause and effect over humoral theory. Or this is the really funny part, they would take the observations of cause and effect and they would twist, this should sound familiar, they would twist humoral theory to match, to create a way that humoral theory could explain why scrubbing the implements with salt and putting in the sun would actually work. Now, I haven't read into it, but God knows it's probably got something to do with wood being warm and salt being cold and the sun obviously being hot and choleric or something like that. Right? But you know, they did cause and effect are very big drivers of medieval innovation and practice, 100%. Yep. Vegan's looking better and better. They did have soap. No, they absolutely had soap. In fact, I just reading the Howard household accounts last night for bedtime, as I often do, 15th century expense accounts, and there's lots of purchases for soap. But soap is good at getting grease out. It's only good so far at being antimicrobial. Salt and sunlight are much more effective as cleansing agents for especially for sterilizing things. They did have soap, and they used it in the kitchen as well, 100%. But after they washed it with the soap, they would scrub it with salt and put it in the sun. Yep. Let me see. Making soap from animal fat is confusing. Yeah, they did. Soap was generally made from rendered animal fat and ash. It's actually not very hard to make soap. And you can make a lye solution, which is basically soap, by just mixing ash and water, and they did that too. In fact, that was hair wash. Hair washes, not shampoo, but hair washes in the Middle Ages were basic solutions, were alkaline solutions made from a mixture of ash and water. And you would comb it through your hair, and the comb would help remove the grease that had been loosened by the lye solution. I demonstrate this actually in a video on this channel if you want to check that out. Ceramics action. Which part is gross? Making soap from rendered animal fat and ash? Yeah. Let me see. Okay. Let's try to get through at least the rest of the items in Sir John Falstaff's kitchen. So for those just joining, welcome to my medieval story time. We were actually supposed to be reading texts and discussing them together, but people keep making really great comments and asking questions. So as always, we've gotten relatively derailed. It was a really short text too. Lots of information to be added though. We were discussing the kitchen goods of Sir John Falstaff from 1430 contained in the Paston letters, specifically the letter that has now been officially defined as 336. And we had gotten up to one pair of tongs as an item in his kitchen. And tongs are really useful for managing the fire as well, especially for moving wood around. These might also be food tongs though. They might also be for fishing items out of pots. They might also be for turning items in a frying pan. You know, there's a lot of things that these tongs could be used for. They're not identified as being metal, so I feel like they're probably not. Which, if they're not metal, then they might not be for fire management. If they're wooden tongs, and I actually do have some pairs of wooden tongs, then they could be for cooking only. We don't know though, because clerks are sometimes lazy and they might not always document everything exactly in the detail that we would prefer. Yep. Okay. Let me see. Farmers still do this on their fields. We don't like to think about it though. Yeah, no, we really don't. Let me see. Oh, Shellback Bo, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm currently fighting a biochemical war against the cold in my sinuses, so I called in sick to work today. Well, I'm very sad you're sick. I'm glad you could be here, though. Okay, then we have one vinegar bottle. I don't know exactly what this vinegar bottle would have looked like. I'd love to be able to identify a specific bottle as a vinegar bottle. We do have lots of ceramic bottles that have survived from the Middle Ages, which could have been for oil or for vinegar. They tend to be smaller, and they have a fatter, wider bottom, and then a narrowing towards the neck, and then a slight widening at the top is what they tend to look like. I've used to have a couple of replica ones, and they were very nice. Unfortunately, one of them, I forgot that it had olive oil in it, and the olive oil went rancid, and there was crazing in the glaze on the inside, and so the olive oil penetrated the bottle, and so we had to throw it away. It was worthless, absolutely useless. So keep that in mind. If you store olive oil in a ceramic jar or a ceramic bottle, you will want to make sure that it doesn't go rancid and that you clean it out regularly. Because yes, as ceramics action will confirm, unglazed ceramics are very porous, which can be great if you want an evaporative cooling effect for, say, a jug of water. I have an unglazed jug, and it's fantastic, ceramic jug, and it's fantastic for chilling water on a hot summer day with no refrigeration. Evaporative cooling for the win. But that also means that if you put something in it that then infests your pottery, I'm not even certain what the best practice would be. I've tried boiling my ceramic vessels that have been infested with something that grows mold, and that has never worked. So I don't know, ceramics action, do you have a best practice for decontaminating infested pottery by any chance? Ceramics by any chance? Yeah, it's a bottle that once held vinegar. Yep, exactly, basically. Okay, people still wash their bottles. I thought we gave that up years ago. I do. I wash my bottles and my jars and I reuse them. I know. I'm staring right now at a giant box filled with glass jars that I regularly reuse because I culture my own dairy. So I make my own yogurt and sour cream and creme fraiche and cultured buttermilk and all that. So I have jars of all sizes, and I specifically keep the glass jars with the metal lids, right? Particularly. Yeah, I'm very old school in so many ways. Okay. Well, everyone, it has been 2 hours. To get through, I'm going to show you the list. These 2 columns, it took us 2 hours to discuss those 2 columns, but that's because you all were asking such fantastic questions. You really were. So it's been a really great conversation. We were able to really delve deeply into a bunch of topics. I feel like I want to at least read one text that is more than a list. Let me see if I can find, this will be an interesting one. Case of sorcery. Okay, are there any final questions about medieval cooking, medieval kitchen equipment, or medieval food before we completely shift to crime and punishment? And we'll do at least one crime and punishment text for the day. Let me see. I sometimes make my own vegan yogurt. Yep. And there is a recipe for something that is like a vegan yogurt in the medieval collections of cookery because of those Lenten fasting periods, right? So basically using almond milk. Almond milk was the Lenten substitute of choice, but almond milk was not something that everyone could afford. It really wasn't. Almond milk was absolutely the purview of the upper end of the socioeconomic spectrum. So no, your average peasant isn't going to have almond milk during the Lenten period. They would have root vegetables, and they would cook them in oil instead of animal fat or butter, but they wouldn't have all these great almond milk substitutions. Oat milk, though, I do have a reference to oat milk in one of my recipe collections. Oat milk would have definitely been something that people where oats were grown anyway, that peasants could have afforded to make. So I do have evidence, medieval evidence of oat milk. I also have, there was another grain that surprised me that they used to make milk from it. Another grain, gosh, what was it? It really surprised me though. So, but it does seem that grain milks were indeed something that medieval people would have used during the Lenten period. And so if you could afford the grain, and it was a grain that could be turned into milk by, crushing it, soaking it in water, and straining it, then they would. So there was a reference to oat milk, and I'm trying to remember which of the cookbooks it was, but it surprised me. It's a very interesting surprise. It might have been Registrum Coquinae, Johannes von Bockenheim's collection of recipes from Rome. But yeah, don't quote me there. It might have been barley. Barley might have been another one too. Yeah, because barley is definitely super, super common. Of course, medieval oat milk wouldn't have been like the commercially available garbage that you generally get now. It would have been oats ground in a mortar and pestle with water so that the milk is basically pulled out by the water and then strained, nothing added. maybe, and especially by people who needed oat milk instead of almond milk, nothing added, just that. No thickeners, no binders, nothing like that. So yeah, not like the stuff you have now, which is a chemistry set and very little oats in it, sadly. A lot of those commercial brands are just crap. Yeah, sadly. This special form of the bottles which you described, is that so that it doesn't spill? Yes. Pagan? Yes. So exactly. So these bottles, they have a wide bulbous bottom, and then a narrow hole at the top. And sometimes they have a little handle. That is no doubt so that, if they fall over, everything doesn't spill. Also by having a narrower hole at the top, you can just cover that with a piece of waxed cloth, for instance, and then it will be sealed. Whereas if you have a big opening at the top, that opens it up to contamination. Cork was not readily available everywhere in Europe. Cork was a luxury item in the Middle Ages. It grew only in Spain, in Extremadura, a specific kind of oak tree. And so in most places, it was a more expensive luxury material. So not everyone could have cork to seal their bottles. And that's why you'll notice almost no corks if you start looking especially in 15th century depictions where you start getting lots of detail. Look at the bottles. Look at them closely. You'll notice there's no corks. They're covered with waxed cloth, right? And that's how they would seal them. Okay, fantastic. So let us move on to our final text today. Crime and Punishment. Sorcery in 14th century England, as it would have been pronounced in the 14th century. Okay, so the format is, it's only a 2-paragraph text. I will read through the entire record from this trial, and then we will go back and I will fill in any blanks and ask your questions. So please reserve all questions for the end of the text. Okay. Sorcery, 1382. On the 26th day of March, in the 5th year of our king's reign, the king being Richard II of that name, Henry Pot, a duchies man, was attached to make answer as well to the mayor and commonalty of the city of London as to Nicholas Freeman and Christina, his wife, in a plea of deceit and falsehood, as to which the same Nicholas and Christina made plaint that, whereas one Simon Gardiner had lately lost a mazer cup, the said Henry came to him and promised that he would let him know who had stolen the cup, and so cause him to regain it. And hereupon, the same Henry made 32 balls of white clay, and over them did sorcery or his magic art. Which done, he said that the same Christina had stolen the cup, falsely and maliciously lying therein, and unjustly defaming the said Nicholas and Christina to their manifest scandal and disgrace, and to their grievance. And the same Henry, being questioned how he would acquit himself thereof, of his own accord, acknowledged that he could not deny the same, but expressly admitted that he had done in manner aforesaid. And because that he thus acknowledged the same, and confessed that he had many times before practiced diverse like sorceries, both within the city aforesaid and without, through which various persons had undeservedly suffered injury in their character and good name, and because that sorcery or the art magic manifestly redounds against the doctrine of sacred writ, It was awarded that the same Henry should be put upon the pillory, there to remain for 1 hour of the day, and the sheriffs were ordered to have proclamation made as to the reason for the same. Probably didn't end how you thought it was going to, right? You probably thought he was going to end up burnt at the stake. So that is not nearly as common as people like to believe it is. Most of the executions of so-called witches or sorcerers is a post-medieval thing. The Middle Ages ends basically more or less in the beginning of the 16th century. That's the beginning of the modern era. The Reformation is really the beginning of the modern era, and that's where we really start seeing the increase in people being tried for witchcraft and sorcery. But the real preponderance of people who are executed for witchcraft and sorcery, that's in the 17th century. That's when the numbers jump up to the thousands. That's when entire towns in Germany, for instance, in very specific cities, I'm thinking Eichstätt, where they kill lots of their population, mostly women, but some men as well. But back to the Middle Ages. So here we have this very interesting case of sorcery being performed. And there's something you have to understand about the medieval church's stance on sorcery and magic. It's not what you think it is. Because what people think the church's stance is mostly actually a set of Protestant anti-Catholic propaganda. The medieval church didn't actually believe in real magic. What they believed that any magic that happened was allowed by God. But that very frequently that people were being deceived by demons or the devil into thinking that they had done magic, but they hadn't. So any magic that happened was allowed by God. And so there was just a completely different perspective on magic and the performance of magic in the Middle Ages. And in fact, we have a lot of manuals of magic that call on Jesus and the saints to perform the spells, to perform the incantations, to accomplish the task at hand, very interestingly. And there were kings who had wizards, sorcerers in their courts who were part of their official retinue. The problem came when people were accused of doing sorcery or magic to the detriment of other people, when they were using it basically as a weapon. That's everyone. Sorry about that. We're back, right? So the real problem came when it was thought that magic was being used for evil. So for instance, when it was thought that there were conspirators conspiring against Henry IV of England and using magic to try to assassinate him, that was a problem. It wasn't the magic itself, it was that it was being used as a tool. That's the problem here also. And you'll notice the punishment for it was the pillory. 1 hour on the pillory, which actually isn't that long, for 1 hour of the day. Of course, they don't say if it's for multiple days. Now, what people would do to you on a pillory is certainly not pleasant, but you weren't allowed to damage people who were on the pillory. You were just supposed to humiliate them. So yeah, okay. Let's look at the comment. Yeah. Seamus the 14th, James the First was quite a witch hunter. Yeah, post Malleus Maleficarum, and well after the Middle Ages, right? James the First of England, right? That's the end of the 16th, early 17th century. That's not the Middle Ages anymore, guys. There were it's just witch hunting and all of that. That's mostly a post-medieval thing. Yep. Oh, wait, sorry, I missed a question. Is the cork the bark or the inner part of the tree? Jim, the cork is the bark, actually. It's the outer layer of the tree. So you can harvest cork from the cork tree safely for the tree so it can keep producing. It's actually the bark, which is the fun part, right? It's the outer layer. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So let's go back to this one bit at a time. So first off, this is happening in London. And we have here on the 26th day of March, the 5th year of the reign of Henry II, Henry Pot, a duchy's man. So this is one of those ethnic references to his point of origin. He's from what they called, he's Dutch, right? He's from what we would call the Netherlands. It is actually in about this time that there are colonies of weavers from Flanders who are brought over to London to set up shop there because the raw material, the best wool in Europe, maybe even in the world actually, was grown, produced in England in this time. The wool of the English sheep was highly coveted because it has this really amazing long staple and this amazing quality that allows it to be woven into the most beautiful, lovely, luscious wool fabric. So they were actually, the kings of England variously started importing colonies of weavers from the places where weaving was a real high-tech art so that they could kind of try to do this vertical integration thing, whereas exporting wool to other places, or fleece to other places to be turned into wool. Instead, the whole production process could be there native, and then there wouldn't be as much money being spent abroad on expensive imported wool fabrics, right? So it could be that Henry Pot was part of one of those artisan communities that were basically imported from the Netherlands, right? Either way, Henry Pot, a duchies man, was attached to make answer as well to the mayor and commonalty of the city of London as to Nicholas Freeman and Christina, his wife, right? So he was basically brought to trial, and he was the interest, the way in which his crime is viewed as that it's not just a crime against Nicholas Freeman and Christina, who's called to answer, right? It's a crime against the mayor of London and the people of London, the citizens of London. And London in the 14th century it's its own world, just like it is now, actually. I guess not much has changed. It was its own world. Yes, the king's primary palace was in London, and yet the king didn't really control London, as many kings found out, much to their dismay, as Richard II found out, much to his dismay. So London has its own hierarchy. It has its own political system. It has its own method of ruling, its own power structure. And so it's, like I said, it's its own world in many ways. It still is its own world in many ways. Okay, was being a king hard? Yes, being king sucked. I don't understand the Game of Thrones, and I don't mean the George R.R. Martin fantasy novel series. I mean in general. I don't understand people who want to play the Game of Thrones. Do they not love living? Do they not love life? Being king is hard. In the Middle Ages, it could easily spell your death by assassination, by usurpation, in battle. I don't understand why anyone would want to be king, honestly, because kings weren't just these lazy lie-about aristocrats that, people imagine, like in the 18th century, a lot of noblemen were. But even in the 18th and 19th century, kings were mostly not lazy lie-abouts. They worked hard. They got up early. They went to bed late. They had meetings after meetings after meetings. They, had to actually dispense justice directly in some cases. They're often in the Middle Ages having to put down rebellions. No one should want to be a king. Like, Countess to me is like the right level on the noble scale, right? You have some lands that are under your control. You have your own little court. You have enough wealth and power to be able to impact people in a pretty positive way and to still live comfortably. But no one is trying to kill you to take your seat. That's the perfect level to me. Duke or Duchess is still kind of, you're running danger. You're in the danger zone of being pulled into the Game of Thrones. I wouldn't want it. Would not want it. Let me see. The Pope was over the king. Well. Was the Pope over the king, though? In practice, not often. Not often in the Middle Ages. In practice, the Pope was not very often above the king. Very often, kings would show that they were the ones who actually had the power. It was not as clear-cut as we might think. Yeah. Depended on the Pope, depended on the king, depended on the era. But definitely not always. Yep. Yeah, heavy is the head that wears the crown. And that is true. And I think, especially there's, been a lot of anti-royal propaganda in the last 150 years. But if you really look at the lives that medieval kings and queens led, and you look at what they did on a daily basis, about how they ruled and reigned, if you really start looking at their legislation, the legislation they passed, that they instituted, you'll start seeing they weren't these evil, greedy, power-hungry bastards that you might think they were. And they definitely were not lazy. Not at all. Yep. Okay, so back to our topic here. So we have Henry Pott, who is being accused of divining where this cup went, missing. So here's what happened. Simon Gardner lost a mazer cup, and the said Henry came to him and promised that he would help him find who had stolen the cup, and so cause him to regain it. So Simon Gardner loses his cup. Henry says, I can figure out who, I can divine. Divine comes from the Latin word, in this case, deviner, with a French word, to guess. I can divine where it came from, right? I can guess where, I can help you figure out where it came from. And to do so, he made 32 balls of white clay and performed some kind of spell over them, right? After which he then claims that Christina had stolen the cup and then accused them of it, which of course, that's going to be a big problem if he's falsely accusing people. But it turns out he wasn't actually doing sorcery. He was just pretending to do sorcery, which is very often how these cases fall out, that they figure out that people are acting as charlatans and trying to swindle people out of their money, because humans will human. Humans will human, everyone. The idea of scamming, pretending to be something or not, pretending to do something or not in order to get money rather than just honestly earning a living, that we have ancient Babylonian, clay rolls that have court cases like this on them. So nothing new. And then, when he was questioned, he acknowledged that it had all been a fraud, right? It had all been a fraud. He acknowledged it. He confessed it many, many times, that he had practiced diverse like sorceries, both within London and without, and that many various persons had undeservedly suffered injury to their character and good name, because that sorcery or the art magic manifestly redounds against the doctrine of sacred writ. And the doctrine of sacred writ is basically what I was referring to earlier, right? It's the idea that any real magic is done with the will of God, with the consent and acknowledgement of God, and that actually any other kind of magic isn't actually magic. If it's done by demons or the devil, they're actually just doing like illusions. They're performing illusions to trick you into thinking that magic has been done when it actually hasn't. So this whole thing of him claiming to do magic is against the divine writ and is superstition and is false. So he's punished not for being a witch, because he's clearly not. He's punished because he lied, because he committed fraud, and he defrauded these people, and for slander, right? And for slander, because of course being accused of theft and getting convicted of theft in most places in the Middle Ages was in some places a capital crime, meaning you would be executed for it. So it's no joke to be fraudulently, accusing people of theft, and especially not to just make some money without actually having to do an honest day's labor. Yeah. So then he gets put in the pillory, and the pillory are the stocks, right? He's literally bound up, so that he can't move, and people can basically throw rotten things at them. It's very unlikely that they were throwing fruits and vegetables. Definitely not fruit and vegetables. You don't waste good food. Food generally didn't rot in the Middle Ages. It wasn't allowed to rot. It couldn't get to the point of rotting. There are no refrigerators in the Middle Ages, in the back of which we lose food and it becomes a science experiment. So it is really more likely that if they were throwing stuff at him, I'm just going to leave that open to your imagination. Yeah, pillory, not pleasant. Yeah, magic is just God's work when you claim it's through God. Yeah, I mean, Joan of Arc, that was heresy. That wasn't about magic at all. Yeah, and Joan of Arc's trial was, I mean, that was a kangaroo court. Like that was never about anything actual real. That was all political. That was, yeah. Finding lost items was a common reason to seek a folk charmer well into the modern era. You can probably still find someone in Appalachia. Yep, 100%. And people believed it. And that's the other thing, is that this man was preying on people's credulity, which is, even worse. Fraud has always been, honestly, in my opinion, fraud has always been and always will be one of the worst crimes, because you're preying on people who are in a vulnerable, needy state. and you're making money off of their misery, and you're not actually giving them solutions. That's the worst. That's the lowest of the low, right? That's the worst. Anyone who can do that and do it again and again and again, there's something broken inside of them, right? There's a lack of empathy there, and that's almost more problematic than anything else. Anyway, yeah. Oh, thank you, Alex. Welcome to my community. Okay, everyone. When were drawbridges created? When were drawbridges created? Interesting. Message retracted. Okay. Oh, necromancy is not what people medieval necromancy is not quite what people think it is now. I can actually recommend, so if you want really deep dive into medieval magic and sorcery, necromancy, all of that, I recommend the channel Esoterica with Dr. Justin Sledge. He is brilliant, and this is his area of real expertise. Go watch his documentaries on witchcraft. Go watch his documentaries on the Inquisition. Very interesting, well-researched stuff, presented in a very calm, beautiful university lecture-like manner with a dry, witty sense of humor that will make you laugh in just the right spots. Yeah, Esoterica. Love his channel. Absolutely highly recommend it. His videos on the Cathars are also very illuminating. And what I love about him is that he doesn't go with the standard pop history. He doesn't even go with the standard necessarily mutually agreed upon history in history departments. He actually goes and looks at original sources to come to new conclusions. So I really love his channel, Esoterica. Great stuff, 100%. Yep, Dr. Sledge is awesome. Love him very much. I wouldn't survive in 1550. So people ask me often, if I could travel back in time to any place and point, when and where would it be? My first answer nearly is always I wouldn't. But if I had to, it would be Al-Andalus, in the golden era of Al-Andalus. So first millennium Spain, like from in the 8th, 9th, or 10th centuries. Like that's where I would want to go. Cordoba or Granada, because it was such an amazing golden world. It really was. Infrastructure, paved streets, sanitation, really skilled and intellectual and educated physicians who actually performed procedures that were successful. Philosophy, poetry, women were not treated like chattel in that time and place. Very progressive, open-minded, Muslim-led kingdom, believe it or not. I know that's hard to believe, but there it is, you know. So that's where I would travel back to, because there was very low violent crime, and it was really a beautiful, beautiful world, metaphorically and literally. But I would prefer not to travel back to any time before antibiotics and vaccines. That's my preference. Just out the gate. Just out the gate, because seriously, in the Middle Ages, you could get a tiny little cut from a nail and die of tetanus in no time. Well, not in no time. You would suffer a lot first. You could, easily die of smallpox. Real common way to die in the Middle Ages. So I just, no, thank you. I like vaccines. I like them a lot. I love antibiotics. I don't want to take them all the time, but when I've got a serious bacterial infection that my body can't fight off, I'm really happy to have the antibiotics. So yeah, there's that. Yeah, I would die back in the day probably of smallpox or measles, but make decent money as a seamstress. Yeah. Until that point, it would be great. Yeah, I do not support the overprescription of antibiotics at all, but there's very good case uses for them, and I'm happy we have them. I'm sad we've created massively antibiotic resistance infections, but unfortunately we can't undo that at this point. But yeah, okay, well, everyone, thank you for having joined me today for this week's medieval story time. Are there any final questions about daily life in the Middle Ages before we part ways? While I wait for your final questions and comments, I will go ahead and thank my channel members and my subscribers, and my Patreon patrons who support my work into researching, recreating, and bringing to life for you all, sharing daily life in the Middle Ages. So if you are interested in supporting my work, then consider becoming a channel member on YouTube or a patron on Patreon. You'll actually then have access to many, many extra perks, hours of full tutorials, extra footage, videos I don't share with anyone else but those members of my community, and access to my Creative Contessa Discord server where we have great discussions, where you can interact with me directly, and where I also share many extra resources as well. So I'd like to thank all of you who just recently joined, and those of you who've been supporters for a long time, and of course, all of you who are part of my community in any capacity, whether you give me money or not. I'm honored to have you here. I love the questions that you ask, and I love our conversations at our live sessions like this. So yeah. Question, did you have fun painting class yesterday? I did. I'm taking a traditional Korean painting class, what some people call minhwa painting. And I'm working on this replica of this gorgeous 18th century original work. And yeah, it was really great. I'm almost done. I'm almost done. This thing is huge. It's like 4 feet tall. It's a big, big painting. It's really wonderful. I'm calling it 50 Shades of Green because there's lots of different shades of green in this thing. You'll understand when you see the finished product, but it's really lovely. I'm really enjoying it quite a bit. Let me see. What kind of banking outside of the church was there? When you say outside, oh yeah, lots of private banks. The Italians set up banks that have nothing to do with the church. And by the church, if you mean the Knights Templar, who were like the first banking system, or the Hospitallers, who also had a banking system, you think of that as being part of the church or not part of the church. I mean, they're technically holy orders, holy knightly orders, but you know, they're not exactly part of the church. But yeah, no, there were private banking. The Italians set up banks all over Europe. The Medici, the Pesce, like there are lots of powerful banking families, not just the Medici, who set up branches all over Europe and make their fortune. So private banking really is invented in the Middle Ages. And so it wasn't just church related at all. And of course, there were a lot of Jewish moneylenders as well, which is a kind of banking. So yeah, and the idea was that you could deposit your money at the branch in Florence, get a letter of credit, and then travel up to Bruges, submit your letter of credit at the Medici bank there, and then get your money safely, right? And you had to actually prove that you were you, so stealing someone else's letter of credit wouldn't generally work. So yeah, that was basically the method of banking. And of course, loans, 100% a thing. The Medici were the bankers to the Pope. That's one of the ways that they became the Dukes of Florence, for instance, ultimately. Yeah. Did the Irish have banking? There were branches of the Knights Templar there, so they kind of did. I wish Philip were here. He'd be able to talk more about that. But he unfortunately will not be back on the channel probably for 2 months because YouTube isn't paying him to do live streams right now. So he's got other things he needs to do with his time to earn money. Yep. Were there loan sharks? I mean, what's a loan shark? You mean where they would charge you like 60% interest? No, because usury was illegal in most places and actually a sin. And even the Jewish moneylenders weren't that usurious, right? And so I'm not certain depends on what you mean by loan shark, I guess. How do you define a loan shark? Predatory lenders doesn't seem to have been so much a thing. They didn't open payday loan shops right outside of military bases where there were dumb poor soldiers who would go and that wasn't so much a thing.
Ferrari.
But yeah. Oh, can I tell you about King George? Oh God. So King George is technically well out of the Middle Ages. I could tell you some things, but that's not really my area of expertise. Okay, the Pope did not run the whole country. The medieval Pope was not as omnipotent as people think. It's a modern myth that the medieval Pope actually ran Europe. Various popes, some popes had more power, some popes had less power, some popes had no power. So yeah, the Pope definitely did not run Europe in quite the tyrannical and monolithic fashion that modern people think. Okay, everyone. Yes.
Do you want the cheese book? I can get it for $60, including shipping.
In German?
Yeah, the German one.
Yeah, absolutely. Get it. Go get that damn thing. Okay. Well, everyone, you may have just heard, but there's this fantastic 15th century cheese travel vlog. and it's only available. I have a digital version in the original Macaronic Latin. Macaronic Latin is not one of my language, but there was a German translation done in 2002. We just found a copy for $60. We are buying that baby. So stay tuned for some readings about cheese from the 15th century. Yeah, right? You're going to get to hear how the cheese tasted, what it felt like, if it melted well or not, what its humoral properties were. And this man traveled all over Europe. His name was Pantaleone. The Duke of Savoy commissioned him to travel all over Europe and to document the cheeses that he encountered. And I will tell you, he is snarky at times. He outright says that there is no cheese worth eating in Flanders. And he says, they have so many cows. They have so much milk. I don't know why their cheese sucks so much. Basically, I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he says in essence. So stay tuned for snarky cheese travel vlog from a 15th century Italian. Okay, well, everyone, thank you so much for being here today. Yeah, there were two popes. There's actually been a couple of periods where there were more than one pope, the pope and the anti-pope, and then there was a 3-pope period even. So it's not as clear cut as people would like it to be. Okay, everyone. Geez, tell me about it. We will be doing, trust me, once I get this book, Tales from the World of Cheese will be coming to Medieval Storytime with the Creative Contessa. Okay, everyone, tomorrow I'll be doing a medieval sewing party during which I'll be hand sewing something. And if you have more questions about daily life in the Middle Ages, tune in then and you can ask me your questions while I'm working on my new Burgundian gown. Otherwise, I hope to see you all. Wednesday, there will be no medieval sewing party. No, sorry, Friday, there will be no medieval sewing party because I'm heading to Thailand. We are heading to Thailand for 10 days. We will be doing medieval sewing parties from Thailand, but Friday is our travel day. If you're interested in following me on my travels specifically, then check out Travels with the Creative Contessa, one of my sister channels, where I'll be vlogging our adventures the whole way there and back again. We'll be talking about handcrafts and food. We'll be exploring beautiful historic sites in the medieval capital city of Chiang Mai. We'll be showing you the beautiful colonial era hotel in which we're going to be staying, and just generally entertaining you by showing you real life from a different part of the world. So if you'd like to see any of that or experience any of that, then check out Travels with the Creative Contessa. Oh yes, Thailand has super yummy food. Northern Thai food is especially super duper yummy. And if you check out my Thailand playlist on my Travels with the Creative Contessa channel, you will see lots of videos about delicious, delicious Northern Thai food. Okay, everyone, until next time, may your adventures in history be creative. Bye, everyone.